Hey everybody, welcome back to Now Let's Be Honest. My name's David.
And my name's Brienne.
And we are here for our finale discussion of The Chosen Season 3.
Yep.
If you were with us a few days ago, we did premiere our discussion of Episode 7, and kind of like with that discussion, this one is not a live stream. And so, I know, I'm sorry, this is just a premiere, it's not a live stream, but that is because if you were not aware, maybe you weren't at the last one, I am actually not in America right now. I mean, as I'm filming this, I am. But as you're seeing this, I am not. Me, Brandon Robbins, and Brandon Snipe are collectively over with a tour group over roaming the Holy Land in Israel. I don't even know where we're at on this day when you're currently watching this. We're probably asleep, honestly, because there's an 8-hour time difference. But we are going to be over there in Israel whenever these episodes go onto the app, and we're going to be over in Israel whenever they go to theaters. And so the creators of The Chosen were kind enough to send us some pre-screeners so that we were able to check this out early. We were only able to watch it one time each. And so really, Brienne and I's day has literally just been taken up by The Chosen. Because she came over to my house, and together we watched episode 7, and then we immediately came in here. We filmed a almost 2-hour video. Then we went and we got some lunch/dinner, and then we sat down and we watched episode 8, and now here we are to film another video, which Lord knows how long it's going to be. And so that has been our day today. Fortunately, neither of us had work because it is Saturday and we're filming it, and so that's kind of how things are going. But here we are. We have finally reached the end of The Chosen Season 3, which means that we are 3 seasons out of 7 done. I mean, that's almost halfway, right? We are 4 episodes away from halfway done with this entire show. How does it feel so far?
Crazy. I didn't even think about that in the whole scheme of things, of it being that close to being done. Wow.
We are more than halfway to the crucifixion. Crucifixion happens in season 6.
Yeah.
So, literally, that's how many episodes we got left. Things are indeed escalating, so that's kind of wild. The way this is going to work is that we are going to do a brief spoiler-free, we're going to do a brief spoiler-free discussion at the very beginning of this video, and then once we move a little bit into it, probably just a few minutes from now, we will go into a spoiler discussion where we just talk from the beginning of the episode to the end. And of course, you can expect me to come out with more videos in relationship to this episode once I get back from Israel, but unfortunately, I can't make those videos until I actually have access to the footage from the episode, and I wasn't able to download this stuff because the screeners that we received, they had like little watermarks that had Daryl's name on them. Like, what was this one? Daryl 2? Something like that? Yeah. And so I want to get the actual footage without any watermarks and stuff like that. And so those videos will come to you once I get back from Israel, and I'm going to have a bunch of vlogs and everything. And then I've got a series that I'm going to do going through the Gospel of Matthew. I've got a lot planned for this channel, so be sure to tune in for all that stuff. But for right now, let's talk about this episode. Spoiler-free thoughts. What did you think about this finale episode of The Chosen Season 3?
I thought it was pretty good. They did some stuff that I wasn't expecting to see. Yeah. And there's also some stuff I was expecting to see they haven't done. I agree with that statement. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, where they pick up with some of those different plot lines in the next season. So,
That's a very good summary, honestly. There are things that they did that I was not expecting them to do. There were things that they did not do that I was expecting them to do. And there were some things they included in the trailer that take place literally seconds before the credits roll.
It's kind of crazy.
And so that was pretty wild. Honestly, my predictions for this episode were not very good. Because the only thing I really got right was that the feeding of 5,000 happened, but that's because we knew that. Yeah. To be fair, they could have pulled a Sermon on the Mount from last year, where everybody thought Sermon on the Mount was going to happen, and then it just like, hey, he walks on the stage and it ends. Yeah. But yeah, so there was a lot of really good stuff here. I will say, actually, you know what? I'll ask you first. Which did you like more, episode 7 or episode 8? Because we watched them both today.
Ooh. I think episode 8.
Episode 8?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like episode 7, but we kind of talked about how it was kind of like a bridge episode. And so I think as a whole, and there's specific scenes, I think, in episode 8 that it puts me barely over episode 7.
Yeah. No, I agree. Specifically the back half of this episode.
Oh, yes.
Launches it up there. That's to where
I'm talking about.
Yeah, like the first half of the episode, it was all right to me. Like if I'm just being entirely honest, the first half of the episode was okay.
Yeah.
But once you got to the back half, I was not wanting it to end.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this episode's about 1 hour 16 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
The screener we got, it said like 1 hour 39 minutes, but that's because there were a lot of credits and then there was also bloopers at the end. And I remember I put it in, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a long episode.
Yeah.
But it was just like the credits, like it had to list like all 5,000 names of everybody involved and everything. But yeah, the episode was 1 hour 16 minutes, and from the moment like the back half of the episode started, it went by so quickly to me. Like, I was like, ooh, this is good. Whereas the first half, it kind of dragged on a little bit and everything. But the back half probably pushed this episode as one of my favorite ones of this season at least, and maybe of the show. I mean, I'm going to have to rewatch it a few times, and eventually later on, I'll come out with some ranking videos for all that stuff. I'll probably drag you into it too. Yeah. We'll rank the season, and then we'll probably have to go back and maybe, we'll see if you end up doing this or not, but rank all the episodes together. So because we have 24 episodes now, plus the 2 Christmas specials, so we have 26 episodes. I think that'd be kind of cool. We'll do that. But for right now, let's actually just hop in and let's talk about our spoiler discussions, because there's a lot of really good stuff I want to talk about, especially when we get to the back half here. If you haven't done so already, be sure to give this video a like, because that'll help YouTube know to spread this out to people and let them know that this is worth watching. And also, please do this for me. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and just like that way you know more videos like this are coming out. That's really helpful, because I know that like I can look at like the analytics, and I don't really do this a whole lot because I don't like tracking that stuff as much, but I do. And it says that like I think 25 to 30% of the people who watch this channel are subscribed, which means there's a lot of people who return to these videos, but they're not subscribed. Please just do that. It'd be super helpful, because that also encourages YouTube to help like promote the videos, and I think that'd be really helpful to me. So please do that if you don't mind. I don't like asking for that though. It makes me feel uncomfortable and weird.
But the motivation behind it is to spread the gospel to as many people as possible.
Yes.
So
yeah, and I do want to
subscription. That's what comes with it.
It's
pretty cool.
Yeah, because I don't want you to think that like this channel's just about The Chosen. It sometimes is just about The Chosen whenever they're airing stuff, but really my main passion is teaching the Word of God. And so in between seasons and stuff, I'm going to be like just like hammering out like a bunch of Bible study videos and stuff like that. That's really my big passion. But while people are watching this for The Chosen, I ask for you to subscribe, because I would love to have you along as we go through scripture together, because that'd be really cool. Shall we go into the spoiler territory?
Let's do it.
All right. So spoiler warning, if you have not seen the episode, don't do this. I should have a spoiler-free review of episode 7 and 8. It should be a much shorter video. If you just go on my channel, it should probably be just a few videos earlier. I haven't filmed it yet, but I'm going to have it uploaded sooner than you see any of these videos. So go check that out if you have not seen the episodes yet, either in theaters or on the app. But if you have seen them, stay here, because we are going to walk through it starting in 3, 2, 1. All right, spoiler time. How does this episode open up, Brienne?
We have King David and a queen of some sort.
A queen of some sort, yeah.
And they are sitting on their thrones, and there is a group of people that come in, and they start to recite/sing a song.
Yes. Yeah. And so this is just kind of keeping with the tradition of The Chosen, where each season they at least include one flashback to something earlier in the Bible. There were a few of those in season 1. There was one flashback, I believe, in season 2, and then one flash forward in season 2. And then right here, we get our one flashback of the entire season. One flashback to Old Testament times. We had a flashback in the last episode and everything. But we have one flashback to the Old Testament times. We get King David, and I believe he is played by the same person who played David in season 2, with the story about with David taking the bread. I don't know for sure. I didn't revisit that episode. We literally just watched it and came and sat down. I'm pretty sure it's the same actor.
Yeah.
And they never say what the queen's name is, and I think that's probably a smart decision, because I'm tempted to say it'd be Bathsheba, but I think this would be too early on in David's life for him to be around Bathsheba.
Yeah.
Because David was probably quite a bit older. This seems like David, who is just freshly anointed king. He's a young dude, but his wife is pregnant. And she was... The reason I was inclined to think it's Bathsheba is because she's holding her womb as if, like, whenever they're talking about the anointed one, she's holding her womb as if, like, a king dwells inside of her.
Yeah.
Which, Bathsheba's son is the one who becomes king.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, but it's not a big deal. I'm kind of belaboring it just because... let me just clarify. We are currently going through the story of David in our Tuesday night Bible study group. And so we finished 1 Samuel. We're now on 2 Samuel. Actually, all those videos are, well, not all of them, but a lot of them are on this YouTube channel. If you want to join us on that, I usually record it and we upload it. So if you want to join us there, that'll be really cool. But we're in the life of David, so that's why I'm analyzing this. But we have David and some sort of queen, and they are called in. They're at the throne room. It's kind of a cool little throne room. Cool. Yeah. Not how I ever pictured it, but very unique. Yeah. And then we have this guy walk up, and he's with Asaph. And he says that Asaph has written this song, but it's a different type of song. It's going to be spoken while a choir hums in the background. And I kind of like how they did it.
I did
it was
too.
kind of, it was like really cool. The humming in the background was really nice. And then they say, we hope that this song pleases the king. And then David, I love that this little thing, David says, and the king.
I know, I like
and
that too.
It's like, yeah, because of course David would say something like that, right? Like it's not just about him, it's about the ultimate king. And the guy's like, absolutely. And then what happens is that they begin to quote Psalm 77. And I'm not going to go look it up or quote it right now. You've probably seen the episode. You should have seen the episode if you're watching at this point. It's a really beautiful psalm, and it's going to play into the episode later on, and so we'll revisit it later on. But one cool thing that we see here is that as David listens, you can see that he's very easily moved by this. And he starts getting teary-eyed, and then we cut to the opening credits. And after the opening credits, we return to where we left off in the last episode, what I'm calling the Anchorman scene.
It's literally right where I didn't expect it to back up like exactly where they left off. It was kind of crazy.
Yeah, because we just see it from a different perspective.
Different angle.
The last episode ended with them running to Jesus, and now we see it from Jesus' perspective, them running that way. Yeah. That was really cool. Yeah. I call it the Anchorman scene because if you haven't seen our last video, like our spoiler talk about episode 7, I talked about how this episode really reminded me of that scene from Anchorman, which if you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's a really stupid comedy. But there's this scene where all these people gather together in this alleyway for this super epic fight, and it's really dumb, and people like are throwing tridents and grenades, and it's just out of nowhere because it's all like news anchor teams, and it's really ridiculous. But that's what the scene reminds me of, because you literally just have more groups showing up, and that continues in this episode as well, to where we have more groups showing up, and they're all just insulting one another. And so I caught the Anchorman scene. Yeah. And so I'm just going to be reading off my notes here. We're going to try to go through this a bit quicker if possible, because it is a longer episode. So Jesus actually turns to his disciples and he tells them to sit down. And then Big James and Philip, they try to resist, but ultimately they do comply with him. Like, they're like, hey, Jesus, we shouldn't be doing this. And he's like, guys, sit down. Which I think is kind of funny. Jesus is treating them kind of like kids. Like, hey, guys, sit down. Yeah. And it's probably a smart way to get people to not, like, start throwing fists. You know, like it's hard to throw a fist whenever you're seated cross-legged on the ground.
To get back up.
And then Jesus invites the people to listen and argue if they want. He kind of makes this reference to how Jewish people love to talk and they love to argue and they love to teach by asking questions. And he says, well, I'm going to do a lot of that. So if you want to, sit down. And if you want to argue, I'll let you do that too. But everybody's going to sit down and listen. Yeah. And so that's kind of fun. Jesus eventually asked them about Veronica, and it's because a lot of them are really confused by what Jesus is doing, and they're starting to debate with him. And he says, what was it? And Veronica was the woman who was healed from the discharge of blood. Yes. Right. And he says, what was it that healed her? And they said, well, it was touching your tassels. And he says, how quickly you forget. What was it that I said? And this is where Matthew, of course, because Matthew's been documenting all this. He says, you called her daughter, and he said, your faith has made you well. And he says, what was that again? Your faith has made you well. He says, exactly. It's about faith. So she was healed not by touching him, but by her faith, and he rebukes them for their little faith. And this is going to be showing up again later on in the episode, towards the end, whenever he rebukes somebody else for having very little faith. Big James responds, and he says, do you see what's going on here? Because he's getting frustrated by all the stuff going on, and Andrew's like, that's the point. So Andrew's looking pretty good in a lot of this stuff, whereas at the end of season 2, he had a lot to learn. Whereas right here, he still seems kind of flustered, but I would say that he's doing a pretty good job holding his composure. Would you agree with that? Yeah. And so he seems to be understanding that Jesus is purposefully instigating certain things. And he's trying to kind of get people to argue, and he's putting people in a very uncomfortable position because he's trying to motivate them towards action here. Yeah.
I feel like ever since after visiting John the Baptist, ever since from that point on, I think his maturity has changed a lot.
Yeah. Interestingly, we see John the Baptist again later here. And that was another thing that was interesting to me, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Judas asks them to increase their faith, because this is something from the Bible, right? One of the disciples says, increase our faith. And Jesus says that they need faith the size of a mustard seed. Mm-hmm. And he begins to explain, and he talks about how it's not literally about the size of the faith, which I like that they did this because people would quote this to me all the time whenever I was a little kid. I've told you this story before, right? It like people need to contextualize things because as a little kid, I did not understand this. People said you need to have faith the size of a mustard seed, and they didn't explain what Jesus meant to me. And I was like, I know I have faith. And spoiler alert for what's coming later. Later on in this episode, Simon Peter walks on water. Right? His name's still not Peter yet. Simon walks on the water. Back when I was a little kid, we have a pool in my backyard. I grew up in this house. We had a pool in my backyard, and I was like, I know that I have faith the size of a mustard seed, because I'm like, that's not very big. I was like, I know I have that faith. And I literally spent like hours. It felt like hours. It was probably like 5 minutes. But as a kid, it felt like hours. And I genuinely would try to walk across the water. And it crushed me because I thought I didn't have faith. Mm-hmm. Because I didn't understand what was being communicated here. And I also, people also misrepresented that whole passage about like specifically it was the part about if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can tell a mountain to get up and move. Yeah. And people were like, you can accomplish these amazing miracles. You can do whatever you want if you have that. They didn't give me the proper context as that. And as a kid, I did not understand it. Yeah. And so I was like, well, if I can move a mountain, I could easily walk across water. I mean, Peter did that. Yeah. I've got faith the size of a mustard seed. Like, that's not very much. And so I would literally do this. And it was only through studying the Bible more and actually understanding the proper context of this that I understood that poor little me had been led astray. Yeah. And so I like little things like this, where Jesus is like, it's not about the size. Like, it's not the size of the mustard seed that matters. He says, we must learn to put God's will above our own. The people need to see faith. And he turns to the apostles and he says, they need to see your faith. And that's why he has them sitting down, even though they don't understand. He's saying, y'all are setting an example for everybody else. And this is really good because it's setting up something that's going to happen with Simon. Because Simon, later on with the whole walk on water thing, he's going to say that he has faith, but his interpretation of faith is, he's misunderstanding it. Different. Because it's about size, right? He's like, of course I know who you are, but he doesn't trust in Jesus' will, right? That's the big distinction. Because he's saying, of course, like, he has the cognitive faith, right? He knows. Right. But he says, that's not what it's about. That's what I was having difficulty with as a kid. Mm-hmm. Because I was like, I know. Like, I had no doubt that Jesus was God and that he died for my sins. I knew that. But it wasn't God's will for me to walk across the water. Yeah. Right? Like, that just was not his will. And faith is about submitting to God's will, and faith is trust. And so I'm glad they're making that distinction. So he turns to the disciples. He says, people need to look at you, and they need to see your faith, which will be an example to them. Yeah. Which is exactly what God was trying to accomplish with the apostles. And then a man approaches, and people start noticing a rancid smell, and this guy says that he has like an infected leg. Did he say it was broken? Yes. Or he had broken it, at least in the past. Yeah, I think he said he had broken it, and I'm guessing that's what made it infected. Like, okay. He wasn't able to get it treated, I would assume. Yeah, and he's still limping on it, so it's still injured. Yeah. Yeah. And so Jesus stands up here because he's been sitting down this entire time. He stands up, and he says that he knows the man. Kind of cool little interaction, because he kind of seems to, this is one of those places where he seems to have known the man would be coming. Right. Which was cool. Yeah. And then he heals the guy. And he says, this is the part, it's kind of like an inside joke, where he says, this is normally the part where I would tell you, like, to not go share the news with everybody, because, like, I don't want the news getting out there, and my time has not yet come. But you can see, we've already kind of caused a scene here, and so, you know what, go do what you're going to go do. Yeah. He says, we're past that. And then the man, he snaps his staff and runs away. He does it with his leg. It's great. And I remember seeing this scene in the trailer. Because in the trailer they showed him snapping that, and I remember being like, is this, like, I remember theorizing about it, because there's this one scene in one of the prophets. Oh man, why am I blanking on the prophet right now? Is it Zechariah? I can't believe I'm blanking on this, but the prophet who grabs like the staff, and he talks about its unity, but he breaks it, and he says, in the same way, so like the land of Israel will be broken, and like God will break off the unity. And I was like, is that guy like doing that? Like, I was so confused, because like I remember it being like a quick scene, and you see this guy like snapping this. I was like, this is a weird thing to do. Yeah. And then I realized, I was like, I was like, oh, he probably got healed, and he's probably rejoicing because it looked like a walking stick. I was like, oh, that makes more sense. Yeah. And so the guy, he runs off, and he's super excited. And we notice this. There's like this new version of like Trouble that starts playing in the background. Yeah, it's like an instrumental, like. Yeah, and it's slightly off, right? So it's not like the same, but it's like. It sounds more Middle Eastern to me. It did, yeah. Which I thought it was cool, because it there was no singing or anything, but because the whole thing was Jesus was addressing the fact that they are causing more trouble.
Yeah.
And that was cool.
Yeah.
And then after everybody sees him heal that guy, everybody sits down. So all the Anchorman people just they sit down.
You see the people up on the hill too.
Yes.
I was watching the people like way in the backgrounds, like up on the hill, and they're just like sit down.
Yep, they're like, okay, we get who this guy is.
Yeah.
All right, so I talked through a lot of that.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts about just that entire scene and just general thoughts about what's going on here? Mm-hmm. What are you thinking about the episode so far as you're watching it? General thoughts.
Mm-hmm. I like how Jesus specifically, how there's a lot of people gathered around, and he's also specifically talking to the disciples, but what he says applies to them, but also applies to like the people that are sitting around. He's directly talking to them and explaining to them how they're going to lead by example, but like in that moment they're also leading by example, if that makes sense. Like it's like a cool thing that I thought was kind of fun. So
yeah, I thought it was pretty good.
Yeah.
And so then we cut back to Capernaum, and we have Zebedee and Salome and Mary Magdalene, and they kind of just go to confront Eden. It's kind of like an intervention in many ways.
Yeah.
And this is something that I guess I misunderstood. We talked about this in our spoiler-filled discussion.
Yeah.
There was one point where Zebedee confronted Simon. They even address it in the scene where Zebedee notices that Simon's been acting weird, and he confronts him, and he says, like, "Don't play games with me, kid."
Yeah.
And he says something about Eden, and I guess I just misheard it whenever we were watching it, because I thought that he had said that him and Salome had visited Eden.
Yeah.
But apparently not, because in this scene, they're visiting her. So maybe I was just being prophetic. I have no idea what was going on there. But Zebedee, Salome, and Mary, they all visit Eden. And over the course of this, they just start talking to them, and one thing I thought was cool, and I have to rewatch the episode, but I thought there was one place in there where they mentioned that Simon and Eden had been married for 2 years, which is just interesting. Like just chronologically speaking, in regards to the show, because we know that 6 months have passed that he's been gone for the 2x2 from the last episode. We learned that, and then it seems like about a year has passed, like in between. Because remember, I talked about how Rosh Hashanah is at September, and the previous like holiday that we'd seen was Feast of Tabernacles, which is in October the previous year. So we know that really about a year and a half has passed, at least since the middle of season 2. And so if they have been married about 2 years, they must have gotten married shortly before the beginning of the show.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. And it would also make more sense for why maybe they hadn't had a kid, right?
Yeah.
So that it makes sense, but I don't know. I just wanted to mention that. I could have misunderstood that, but I thought there was a place in there where they suggested that they'd been married about 2 years. And Zebedee mentions his encounter with Simon. He wants to know what's wrong. He says that Simon seems distracted, and he knows, like, they could tell that the distractedness must have something to do with the marriage and their relationship. And they really just offer a listening voice. And I thought that was good that they're there for her.
Yeah.
Zebedee mentions that he fished with Jonah, Simon's dad, for 20 years. And really just interesting little detail they threw in there is that Jonah never really knew, that they never really knew each other, because it seems like maybe Jonah was a pretty closed off guy. Which is interesting, because I guess they're just kind of explaining where Simon gets this from, that Jonah's just a pretty reserved dude who his default was just being closed off against people.
Yeah.
And so Zebedee's like, hey, I fished with him for 20 years. I never got to know this person.
Yeah.
And he says that Simon's been trying to counteract that, but he's acting more like his dad right now.
Right.
Which I thought that was kind of a fun little thing, like character development thing they threw in there. Simon's been better, but lately he's been acting weird. And then this is where Eden begins to clutch her stomach, and Salome reads the room, and she asks Zebedee to give her and Mary a moment, because she realizes, it seems like she can tell what's going on. At the very least, she can tell something so private that maybe a man should not be in here. Which was good, I think. And then we cut outside, and I want to hear your opinion on this.
Yeah.
We see Zebedee looking at a broken pottery vessel. And I'm assuming that this is the one that Simon broke. Yeah. I thought that he's cracked it on the roof.
That's what I thought. Whenever I saw it, I thought he was on top of the roof.
Yeah, so I might, once again, we've only seen episode 7 and 8 once each. We couldn't watch it multiple times. So I don't know if this is the same vessel. I'm assuming it is, because they're at Simon and Eden's house. And I'm assuming Simon was on top of the roof. And I guess he threw the vessel down.
I guess so.
Onto the,
ground.
I don't know. It was kind of confusing. But then Zebedee, looks at the pottery, and he has, some sort of realization, and he, goes off. What do you think that's Like, because we never have it addressed any place else in the episode, right?
Yeah. No, we don't. Not that I know of, at least. Not that I caught. Yeah. I don't think so.
Does Zebedee even show up again? I'm trying to think. I mean...
I don't think so.
I don't believe he does, because pretty much everything else after this is, like, more over in, like, with the disciples and everything.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Who was it that, remember the little kid was that wasn't Zebedee, the dad, who had stopped that little kid from breaking the pot, right? Because remember...
No, that was Jairus.
It was Jairus. Okay, yeah, I was like, I didn't know if he had drawn a parallel between those two things or something like that. Yeah, I don't really know what that is. Whenever he was looking at the pottery, right before it cut to the next scene, you could hear, like, it was silent for a while, and then you could hear the background noise of, like, the girls talking, and it sounded like Eden crying before it ever cut to them while he was still looking at it. So I don't know if that was supposed to, like, hint us in, like, or if it was just supposed to be, I don't know, he realized that I guess it was Simon that did it.
Yeah.
Like, and so her crying was, like, it's supposed to be us, like, trying to relate them together. Because, I mean, if you just saw a broken pottery outside of the house, you'd be like, well, that's kind of weird. But
well, I was trying to think
it wouldn't immediately, I guess, be like, oh, Simon did it, you know?
Yeah, I was trying to see if it was, like, supposed to be, like, metaphorical or something, like, ooh, she's a broken vessel or something. I don't know. I was trying to figure out what that was, and the fact that it was never addressed again made me think that we were supposed to understand it.
Yeah.
Mainly because this is a finale, and it didn't seem like a big enough plot element to carry on to the next season. Because typically whenever we see Zebedee, it makes me think that, like, it's dealing with something in regards to, like, the olive oil business and stuff. But it would also be really weird that, like, he's leaving this very heavy moment.
Yeah, no.
And then he's immediately, like, thinking about work and rushing off to that.
No.
But, like, he looks at it, and then he, like, rushes off somewhere.
Yeah.
And I don't believe, I mean, my notes might prove me wrong in a second. He might show up again, and we just forgot about it.
Yeah.
But I don't believe he shows up again in this episode.
I don't think he does.
And so I'm assuming this is something that's going to carry on into the next season. But the moment itself... I don't know. I was just okay.
I was kind of confused by it.
Like,
I wasn't sure what to make.
This is one of those things that seems like it would happen, like, in an earlier episode, and it would carry into the next episode, but since this is, like, in between seasons, it doesn't seem like a major enough moment for people to be thinking about it during the months leading. You know what I mean? Like, there's just, like, certain plot elements where you're, like...
attention grabbers.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just... Something about that was just kind of weird to me, and I was wanting to see what you thought. Yeah. Okay, cutting back inside the room, we have Eden. Also... Let us know what your thoughts are on that in the comments down below, or if we missed anything.
I was about to say, they might have caught something we didn't.
Yeah. And so then, back inside, Eden admits to her miscarriage, and she mentions that she has been cleansed in the sea, but not in the mikveh. A mikveh is a cleansing pool for Jewish purification reasons. But she says that didn't help with them. Oh, well, Salome, or either Salome or Mary, one of them, she mentions, okay, well, yeah, you did that, but that's not going to help with the baby or the miscarriage, right? Like, because that pain is still there.
Yeah.
And then she mentions that Veronica, which once again is the woman who had the discharge of blood, she was so happy and so carefree and so joyful whenever she came out of the water. But Eden was just beginning to grieve.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting because whenever we see the episode, that's the end of episode 6, I believe it was. Yeah. To where we see all the guys, like, goofing off in the water, and we think that Eden's really looking at them. But it seems like, I guess, her attention was more so on Veronica, right? And so, like, really she felt lost, like, she kind of felt abandoned by everybody, I guess, but she was chiefly focused on Veronica and the fact that she seemed so happy while she was being there grieving, and then her husband was out there just goofing off. Was Simon with them? Oh, yeah, because Simon didn't know about the,
he didn't.
Wait, hold up.
Thought he was.
I'm getting all this mixed up. Episode 5, hold up. Episode 5 is whenever they were healed, right? Because one episode, it ended with, I gotta, like, check my thing real quick. Yeah, episode 5 is the one where she was healed. Episode 5 is the one, because I was like, no, like, because they addressed it, because I remember episode 5 ended with Eden looking at them playing in the water.
Oh,
and episode 6 ended with them, like, confronting one another. Yeah. Yes. So, Simon didn't know about it yet, so he was playing out there with them as well.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I just needed to check that. I kind of had a brain fart. Okay, so Mary says that Eden needs time to grieve, and Mary tries to, like, you know, she's like, hey, I haven't been through stuff like this, but Eden still says, hey, your opinion still matters, which I appreciate. It's a very subtle way with the chosen creators pointing out, like, you don't have to have experience on something to give advice.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you just need to have something worth saying, right? Which doesn't mean that everybody needs to be giving advice, but it does mean that there's room for that even if you don't have experience. And then Eden kind of just voices her main problem. Jesus gave Veronica healing and joy, but not me. Which is kind of the issue that Simon's going through too. So really, Simon and Eden are going to be having the same struggle. They're just doing it separately. Which kind of makes me think of that Casting Crowns song, Broken Together. Really good song, but it's about two broken people in a marriage trying to be broken together. Which, I don't know, made me think of that. Mary Magdalene tells her that she should go to the synagogue because maybe the words of God will bring healing, which sure enough is exactly what's going to happen. How do you think that whole thing was handled between all of them?
I thought it was really good. I thought it was cool that Mary was included in that. You know?
Yeah.
Like, it was just, I wouldn't have thought, like, I would think Zebedee and Salome, because they're just, like, the older figures that are there. Like, if her husband's gone, Jesus is gone, it's like, Zebedee's kind of there to take care of the women. And so it makes sense for them two to talk. But I thought it was kind of cool that they brought Mary along, and I think Mary does bring a certain, like, asset to the situation, just because she has grieved a lot, even though it's very different from what Eden's going through. But I thought that was really cool that she was included in that. Yeah.
It's always funny to me because Mary Magdalene is always presented, like, on the show as, like, the most, like, profound of all of the people. Like,
I know. She has some very insights.
Yeah, like, she just has, like, the deepest insights. Like, I don't know what it is about, like, her character or something, but, like, the creators of the show always give her, like, the deepest, like, theological insights to everything.
The really quotable lines, too.
Yeah, which it's just kind of funny to me because we know so little about Mary Magdalene, but if I was only watching the show and I wasn't familiar with the Bible, I would leave thinking that Mary Magdalene was, like, just, like, this expert theologian, more worthy of, like, the title rabbi than anybody else on the show other than Jesus. But yeah, I thought it was cool that Mary Magdalene was included here, too. I didn't even notice her. Like, we were watching it, and to be fair, I'm looking up and down taking notes. Yeah. But I was like, when did Mary get there? Like, I thought it was just Salome and Zebedee who showed up, but Mary Magdalene was there, too, which was cool. But then we cut back to Jesus in the crowds, and he's continuing to teach them. And this whole scene was kind of hard to take notes on because things became so rapid fire that literally everybody's just launching arguments at everybody. And so one lady, her name is like Patia. She's the Nabatean. She's from Nabatea. And she explains the mission's impact on their society and starts listing out all these different, like, grievances. Then there's another person who's talking. I don't remember his name. Then there's another dude named Adamus. But the way that people say it with their accents, it's hard to tell if they're saying Aramas, like with an R, or Adamas with a D. Yeah. It was kind of hard to tell. Different people said it different ways. I'm thinking it's Adamas. He was a bronze caster, or according to my notes, a bonds caster, because I forgot the R. And he's just this dude dressed in blue, which I must have written that because I think Jesus said something. He was like, this is very fancy clothing.
Yeah, you dressed really well. Yeah.
It's just so funny to me seeing, like, all these people argue while sitting cross-legged. It just, to me, it was just funny because, like, it was just interesting how, like, a little command, like, telling people to sit down, it just makes all their arguments seem so petty. You know, because, like, they're not, like, standing up with their fingers pointed. They're just, like, they're sitting cross-legged like kids, and they're all on the same level. Yeah. And, it's just, something about that was cool. And Jesus was standing the whole time. Yep. Right? So Jesus is the one over them, but he's, like, trying to, like, he put them on the same level. And, I don't know. Something about that was just kind of cool. Yeah. And the bronze caster dude, he's, like, blaming people, and he's, like, citing, like, omens, and he's thinking that it's affecting, like, his pagan rituals. Yeah. He says that Jewish rituals are laughable, and this gets the sons of thunder mad, and Jesus says, hey, guys, maybe we don't need thunder right now. And just this whole thing, it's just getting really out of hand real quick, right? It's escalating real fast. So everyone's arguing, and Jesus just says, everyone needs to stay on topic. This was just interesting to me, seeing, like, how the writers of the show, like, obviously none of this stuff is biblical, right? This is just, like, a hypothetical scenario. Yeah. I just thought it was funny how the creators of the show portrayed Jesus handling conflict, because I've never really thought about that. Like, me neither. You know, I mean, you see Jesus in the midst of conflict sometimes, but usually, like, he's the one stirring it up, or he's the one, like, addressing it through, like, rebuke. But we've never seen, like, how Jesus, like, handles, like, petty arguments. Yeah. You know? And so I just thought it was kind of funny. Just seeing, like, how Jesus is like, stay on topic. It was kind of entertaining. The people finally bring up the parable about the banquet, which was what was brought up in the last episode. And the Jews cite that the people had good reason for rejecting the offer. Jesus says things are going to be different now, right? Because they're not doing the old way of things, which is something that they keep bringing up throughout this whole season, they brought this up. Like, people aren't going to like it because they're so stuck on their old ways. And this is really the writers of the show commenting on the Bible verse that, you know, talks about how the Pharisees very often taught the traditions of men as if they were the commandments of God. And I think the writers of the show are highlighting that it wasn't just the Pharisees who did that. It's everybody, right? Because we all just get in our way of doing things, and we attribute a almost spiritual quality to those things whenever they were just created by us, not by God. But they always use that same language. Like, people aren't going to like the new way of doing things. And I just wanted to address that because we got to be careful with that type of language. Because sometimes people will use that language to justify, like, really weird teachings. Yeah. And I'm not saying that's what the writers of the show are doing, but I just want to point out that all because you use that phrase does not justify doing something, right? That's also how cults get started. Right. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. It's just, I think they're taking what Jesus taught and they're helping broadly apply it to a more general audience so that we don't come across with it. Like, some people might come across from that, like, they might leave scripture, and if they're interpreting it wrongly, they might end up with like an anti-Semitic view or something, because they forget that Jesus was a Jew, and they forget that Jesus is like the fulfillment of Judaism, right? And they'll be thinking, oh, well, the Pharisees were this, and they just like start villainizing them, and they fail to realize that we're all guilty of this. Yeah. And so I think that's what the creators of the show are doing. I just wanted to address it. And then Jesus mentions that God wants his house full, so he's interpreting the parable for them, and everyone who believes in him can come, both Jew and Gentile. The people admit that the strife was already there, because Jesus points out, he's like, oh, so what? You're saying that everybody was totally at peace, and then my disciple showed up and caused all this problem? And then I think it's mainly Leander who speaks up, which Leander's kind of an interesting character to me.
Yeah, just kind of randomly pops up here and there.
Yeah, yeah, he just kind of randomly starts talking. I'm like, okay, cool. For something about him, like, even through these episodes as well, I don't know if it's just like the actor or something, but he gives me like he gives me like a feeling that like he has ulterior motives. Yeah. I don't know why, but I remember saying that when we were talking about episode 6. Oh, yeah. Whenever he like creeped in, I remember saying this, like, I was like, this guy seems like he's got ulterior motives for some reason. But then in episode 7 and 8, so far he doesn't. He seems like he just really likes Jesus. But something about how he plays the character or something, I don't know if that's just like the actor's personality or something. Something about it, just like, it seems like he has ulterior motives to me. Like, everything he's saying, I feel like he's got something else planned. And I don't think he's supposed to. I think it's just... and I don't know if other people, I don't know if you read it that way or not, but...
I do, yeah.
Something about it, like, whenever I'm watching it, I just... even, like, in the last episode, whenever, like, they were peeking over the hill, and, like he sees Jesus coming, I thought he was about to, like, lead people to go, like, attack Jesus.
That's what I thought, too.
Yeah, and then he just comes up, he's like, hey, Jesus, good to see you, and I was like, oh, like, something about it, like, it just all seemed very sketchy to me. Yeah. And maybe that's his personality. Maybe he's supposed to just be a weird guy who kind of, like, you know, you never know what to make of him. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. But he does bring up the fact that, the strife was already there, but everyone kept to themselves. Oh, this is Adamus who's talking, right? Aramis is like, oh, well, the strife was already there, but everybody kept to themselves, right? They all just kind of hung out with their own groups, and this leads them to all start further debating like all the religion stuff. And then they end up turning on Jesus, and they start talking about him being popular, and he says the goal was never to be popular, and they said, well, too bad, that is the result. You are popular now. And then Aramis turns to him and says, looks like you've arrived at your first failure. And Jesus kind of like, he like kind of like looks a little stung by that. Yeah. I don't know if you noticed that, but like whenever like he says that, Jesus kind of like just like kind of just like does like this little head thing. It's like, ooh, first failure. And then Leander, he does speak up and he says, if you are who you claim, why the division? He doesn't say that word for word, but he starts saying like, why do some people react positively to you? Why some negatively? Yeah. Which I get what they were going for with the question, but that's kind of inherent to somebody like anybody, you know, like there's no single person who's going to like appeal to every single individual. Yeah. And like they just pointed out, he's popular, and popular people typically will like, you know, the more
popular, probably the more division you're gonna have.
Well, yeah, I mean, like
more people.
It's funny, like as this channel grows, I see more positive comments and more negative comments. Like, you know, people just like, nobody's gonna be liked by everybody, right? I mean, even like the best author in the entire world still has its critics, you know? Right. So it was kind of a weird question. He's like, why the division? I was like, have you never met a human before? But I got what they were like. They were just trying to address the question. Yes. And so he asked about why the division, and then Jesus begins to share the parable of the sower. which is, about the seeds and everything. But this is whenever they start noticing that people can't hear because the crowds are getting too big. And Jesus says, all right, we need to organize everybody. We need to figure out another way to do this. And so he says, give me a second, to be continued. We will return to our regularly broadcasted teachings in a moment. And so he starts splitting everybody up. And then we cut to this very brief scene where we get the horse rider dude. He was a Hellenistic Jew from the Decapolis. His name turns out to be Nahshon. We don't learn that until a few scenes from now. But his name is Nahshon. He showed up in the last episode as one of the first ones to show up and confront Jesus after Jesus healed Telemachus' dad. And Nahshon shows up, and he's riding down to Jerusalem, and he comes across this woman, and I don't even remember what he was asking her about. Maybe he was asking her for directions or something. I'm not totally sure. But she notices that he doesn't have tassels on, and she's like, oh, they're not going to like that. It's also interesting to me that everybody has talked about the tassels so much in this season. I thought too, yeah. Yeah, it's almost like the writers of the show, like, in between seasons, they learned a lot about Jewish tassels, and they're like, we're going to just talk so much about tassels this season. Like, it's just, like, a huge deal, whereas, like, in past seasons, it was never, like, a big deal, like, they would get mentioned, but something about this season, the tassels are huge. And so they draw attention to the fact that he's not wearing tassels, but this just highlights the fact that Hellenistic Jews have adopted Greek culture and different stuff, and it allows for more theological discussion in time to come. And she mentions that a storm is coming, and this was fun, because this was our first reference to the fact that a storm was rolling in, but we didn't know she was talking about a physical storm. Right? She's like, oh, a storm is coming, and she seems to more be talking about, like, like, the fact that he's not wearing the right stuff, but apparently she's also saying, like, you need to get to Jerusalem because a storm is coming. But technically the storm's not going to come till the next day. And he says, yes, a storm is indeed coming. And sure enough, a storm is coming, but we'll have to see that. We go back, and now Jesus is once again speaking to the crowds. He shares the parable of the sower with them. And then the disciples, we cut to them, and we see them teaching the groups. And you seem to find this pretty funny.
I did.
Because, like, Jesus would say something, and then, like, in the background, you just hear, like they just start reciting it.
There'd be little pauses in between, which I would imagine, I was thinking about it, well, because we see Jesus talking, like, for so long, it's like daytime, he's like, okay, hold on, let's reorganize things, and then he's talking throughout the day, and then it cuts back, and it's like nighttime, and they all have, like, torches. Like, he was probably talking for a long time, and it's like, well, probably because he has to pause every once in a while, so that way they have time to repeat.
Oh, for sure.
They repeat it, and he's like, okay, now I can move on, let me say a few words. Okay, now they gotta repeat it. Okay, hold on a second. And so, but...
Which is kind of how it works a lot of times whenever people go, like, do mission work. Like, they'll have, like, translators who do the same type of thing. So the disciples are sharing Jesus' words, and then we cut to John. And John is impressed by the growing crowds, but then Simon is just kind of, like, staring silently. And he's just, like, you can tell once again, Simon is just off in his own world. And so that whole discussion with John, he has admitted to what's been going on between him and Eden, but that hasn't helped anything. And so Simon is still off in his own world here, which is very interesting. And then we cut to nighttime, and we're down in Jerusalem, and Shmuel is interrupted while he's asleep. And he finds Nahshon waiting for him, and this is the guy from the Decapolis, which, man, dude must have been hauling. I mean, like, he went down all Israel. Like, he went from Galilee to, I mean, Decapolis is on the other side of Galilee, right? It's like the Sea of Galilee, right? It's to the east. He went all the way down there to Jerusalem from, like, afternoon to nighttime. Homeboy was moving fast. Like, this dude was going quick. So he gets down there. He reports about Jesus according, he talks about, like, Shammai's edict and stuff like that. And really, at the beginning, Shmuel's just totally distracted. He seems like he's grumpy because he just got woken up in the middle of the night. And he's like, dude, you're wearing, like, take that vest off right now because you're not supposed to wear blended fabrics. And the guy's like, oh, I thought that was, like, an outdated law because, like, I thought it was about, like, the time of the Canaanites. And honestly, he brings up stuff that we talk about nowadays, right? Like, whenever we're talking about, like, stuff that Paul says regarding, like, headdresses, like, is that a cultural thing or not? And this dude's like, I thought that was a time related thing. And then Shmuel's like, Torah is timeless, and he's like, message received. And he's like, and get your tassels on, man. And so, not a welcome, like, he wasn't welcomed very well. Not very good first impression. But then the guy mentions that he's been hearing the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth.
He was like, of where?
And as soon as Shmuel hears this, his whole, like, everything changes. The demeanor. There's the word I was looking for. This is why she's here. She's smarter than I And so as soon as Shmuel hears this, he says to get the guards together, get everybody together, and they're going to go down there. I thought he mentioned guards, but I guess he didn't because, or unless maybe guards were the ones guiding the.
He mentioned someone, yeah.
Yeah, because eventually what they're going to have is they're going to have like the different religious leaders going. And then we have Atticus, which Atticus just shows up throughout this. I still don't know what they're doing with Atticus throughout this show.
He's a fun character.
He's a really entertaining character. I just don't fully know his purpose yet. Like, they're giving him so much screen time throughout all of this show.
Yeah.
They've got to be heading somewhere with this. Like, he must end up being the guy who says this man was the son of God or something. Because he's just present at too many things, and it goes unexplained. For them to head nowhere with this character would just seem really weird. Like, at that point, it would just almost be like, maybe like the actor was like a friend of the creators, and they're like, yeah, we'll give you a part. I don't know. Because like, Atticus is really fun and really interesting, but so far, he really has done very little.
Yeah.
We know he's Pilate's confidant and stuff like that, but
I think he's just like a mysterious character to me. He reminds me of, what is that called? Like the Red Rider or something like that. Like it's like a it's someone who, it's like this character who's always, it's like this hooded person that always just rides like on a horse. I forget where I've heard there's a story of it. They're called like the Red Rider or something like that, and that's what he reminds me of, because I feel like every time we see him, he's very mysterious, but he's also like always on a horse, and he has like his like hooded cloak that he wears.
Yeah.
And so that's what it reminds me of.
Yeah.
It's like the Red Rider.
Yeah. I get that. Nice.
Yeah.
I'll have to look up Red Riders later.
Yeah. I could be saying it wrong. Don't quote me on it.
Yeah. But he brings Nash on the horse, and he starts complimenting the horse, and like, once again, like you said, he's mysterious because you don't know what his motives are. No. He comes across very intimidating, and he's like, "Oh, such a nice horse."
He's charismatic, so it's hard to.
Yeah.
It's hard to.
But yeah, it's hard to like not like him or anything like that. But like, he just comes across very intimidating though, because he's like, "You have such a nice horse. Kind of weird that you would leave it untethered." And like he just like has like weird questions. And then the guy says that he's like, he says, "Oh, I come from the Decapolis. I've been around this teacher." And of course, Atticus is like, "I'm fascinated to know more."
I know, yeah.
Like, just like the, you know who he reminds me of sometimes? Mike.
You know, that's true.
Which y'all don't know who Mike is.
No.
You don't know who Mike is. Mike is one of our friends.
Our words.
But he reminds me of Mike, just like how he talks. Like, I'm fascinated to know more. Like,
it is.
Yeah.
It does.
I don't know. Just something about that.
Very curious person.
Or George. Or George. Mike or George. Both of them kind of
curious
like,
people.
Yeah. I don't know.
It's good to be curious.
Yeah. Yeah. But okay. Sorry. Y'all aren't gonna understand anything we just talked about. All right. So now it's nighttime. Because it's been nighttime whenever Atticus was talking to Nashin, and whenever Shmuel woke up. But it's nighttime now, and Jesus is preaching to all the people. He's calling for repentance. And then he starts quoting stuff that comes from the Bible, and I have to look this up, but I'm pretty sure he's quoting from like different scriptures here. He could be quoting from the same thing. Some of it sounded like it came from the Gospel of John, though. But real quick, actually, could you just read off some of the stuff he talks about here? Yeah. And I'm going to go look up the passage that I'm thinking it is. But
yeah, so the first thing he's talking about is he thanks the Father for hiding things from the understanding and revealing it to all children. And then he says, all things handed him from the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and vice versa.
Yeah. So, turns out this actually was the, it's all the same passage. I was just surprised. I didn't realize that, I don't remember that all being, like, connected together there in the Gospels. But it's in Matthew 11, because it leads to the "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest," which Dallas and them have said that that's, like, the theme of the whole season. But it is all together. It says, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and understanding and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for such was your gracious will. All things have been handed over to me by my Father." And I remembered all of that being tied to the "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden" part. But this next part right here was the part that I thought it was from the Gospel of John. Not necessarily because I didn't remember it from Matthew, but because it's more Johannine in like what it's saying. Yeah. It says, "No one knows the Son except the Father. No one knows the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." Like, that's big stuff in the Gospel of John. And so for some reason, whenever he said that, I didn't remember it being in that select portion. And so I thought they were like just like weaving stuff together, but turns out they were not. That was actually just quoted straight from there. And then he says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I'll give you rest." Yeah. And everybody's just like locked into this, right?
Yeah.
And then he says, "Speaking of rest, we all need it now, including me. And he's like, we'll continue tomorrow. So he's like, everybody go get some sleep and get some rest. And so you see all the disciples like, scuttering out. They're trying to get away. And then apparently, I guess they took a nap. I guess they had tents and stuff. Yeah. And they slept. So. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they had a tent whenever we come later and they start preaching the next day. There's a tent in the background. Whenever they have the baskets. Yeah. You see in the background.
Cool. All right. And so we cut to Matthew walks over to Judas. And he asks Judas for the count of how many people are there. Yeah. Because once again, Matthew, he's documenting all of this. I love that they always include that. Matthew's documenting. Too. And they say, well, there's 1,000 like down from the east, and then there's all these ones, and they basically say 2,000 and counting, right? So more people are showing up, and it's becoming a pretty big group. And then Andrew and Philip start talking about how the Gentiles are all gathering around, and they're running out of food, and that's problematic. Yep. Simon says this isn't their problem, and Simon just does not seem focused on this at all in any way whatsoever. Yeah. But Andrew and Big James say that Gentiles have been driven away from their homes, and so it kind of is their problem. And they start kind of being really harsh on Simon. But this is really cool because John cuts in and says, like, hey, like, be gracious to your brother. And Andrew's like, why should I be gracious? And I just thought that was kind of cool just from, like, an outsider's perspective. It sends a message to us. Like, sometimes we'll be very quick to snap at somebody without knowing what they're going through. Yeah. And it's always like I thought it was cool seeing it to where like John's defending him, but you could easily see why Andrew would respond to Simon in such a way. Yeah. Right? And the thing is, Simon, even though he's going through all this stuff, that doesn't justify him being the way he is. Right? Like, yes, you do need to grieve and stuff, but that also doesn't justify you being a jerk and being inconsiderate of others. Right? So Simon is in the wrong here. Andrew and James are also in the wrong. John's really the only one in the right, but that's because he's actually looking at things from all different angles. And I just thought that was kind of cool because so often we do just kind of curve inwards and we lash out at people and we don't know the full story of why they're behaving different ways that they are. Yeah. But there always is more to the story, and so I think it's just kind of cool to encourage us all to be more gracious and stuff. But I just like that little detail where John's like, hey, be gracious to your brother. Whereas literally earlier in that same day, John had been lashing out at Simon and had been very impatient. Yeah. And so I thought that was cool. He tells them that Jesus said the success of their trip depended on Simon, which is something that they didn't know, right? Because Jesus had pulled John aside and told him that privately. Right. Now John says, Jesus said this trip depends on him. It's like, oh, that's kind of wild. And then this is where Simon, honestly, is kind of depressing. He had like a very nihilistic, like fatalistic approach to life. And he just says, like, Jesus will do what he wants in the end. If he wants to provide, he will. Right? So, like, basically, it seems like from his perspective, he doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Right. Jesus is going to do his own thing. And really, it seems like you can see what his struggle is, right? He thinks that Jesus doesn't care. It seems like that's really the issue. Yeah. And he says, you know what? No matter what we do, Jesus is going to do what he wants. And we're going to have to get over it. And I just thought that's a pretty low place to see Simon at. Like, they kind of just move on after that. But whenever you just pay attention, like what Simon's saying and like reflect on his words, like it's kind of pretty heavy stuff to be saying. What do you think about that entire interaction? Sorry, I want to make sure that I ask you stuff because you're a naturally more silent person, but people will get on to me in the comments if I don't at least like ask. So
yeah, well, I was gonna say the part with John, which you had already kind of said, but I thought it was cool that out of any of them that would have been the one to speak up, it was John that spoke up, just because they were constantly bickering before, and John was the first one to like say stuff about Simon. He didn't want anything to do with it. He didn't want to stay behind. He didn't want to help Simon out, and so it was cool that he was the one to mention to be gracious. So,
yeah. I like John's character quite a bit. I think that the guy who plays him does a very good job. So we cut to the next morning, and now we have Yanni and Shmuel traveling up to Decapolis, and they have another man named Ozim, who we've never met before, I don't believe.
I don't think so.
But he's another Pharisee, and he is just like sawing logs, snoring, leaning on Yanni, and Yanni's very obviously uncomfortable. But then eventually Ozim wakes up, and they immediately, I mean, imagine waking up to this, immediately dive into like a theological debate about stuff, and Ozim is complaining about having to get up so early and travel all the way over here to do all this stuff. And Shmuel points out we're supposed to serve God first, then our families. Ozim responds by saying we serve God by serving our families, which is, once again, those are just modern debates people have, right? Like, how does that work? Which I think both are technically true. You do what God asks you to do, and if he's given you a family, you take care of that family. But also, I mean, like, Simon's in the same situation, right? So I thought it was interesting that got brought up.
Yeah.
Yanni criticizes Ozem for complaining about having to serve God because he's like, you know, you're basically all talk, no action.
Right.
He's like, you're over here saying that we should take the law seriously and everything, and we should serve God with our lives, but then, like, you have to wake up a little bit early and you're complaining. Which is also probably a fair criticism of a lot of us, because we're guilty of the same thing. Ozem wants to know why they're meddling in the Decapolis, because there's more syncretism and paganism in the Decapolis than they could wish to address in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
Which I think is also a fair point. There's a lot of stuff, like, I love that they're making these characters so complex, because even by the end of the episode, Shmuel seems like he's pretty shaken up and everything.
Yeah.
And so I like that they're making these characters, like, they're not just black and white villains. Like, they say stuff, which is a good point. It's like, yeah, I mean, you've got to be shrewd and you have to be cunning and you need to know exactly where to devote your time and you have to be wise. And he points out, he's like, yeah, it makes sense to address false teachings in Jerusalem, because if we're going to make a change, it's going to be there. Going to the Decapolis, I mean,
majority of people are not.
Yeah, he's like, everywhere is sinful. Like, and you got to ask, like really both, you could see both perspectives, because if everybody there is sinful, then they're the ones who need it most. But at the same time, you're right. You might not have as much of an impact. But at the same time, God can accomplish a lot through one person. I mean, Jonah went to Nineveh, right? And so you can see arguments from both perspectives. And so I like that. Like, it's a difficult decision. Like, should they be meddling in the Decapolis? I don't know. Obviously, we don't approve of what they're doing because they're opposing Jesus.
Right.
But it's a fair discussion to have. Shmuel responds and he says, sorry, false teaching is such a burden to you. And then I like that Ozem responds and says, sorry, false teaching is such a burden to you. Because two totally different perspectives, right? From Shmuel's perspective, he's kind of mocking him, saying, like, I'm sorry that it's such a burden to you that, like, you know, like, you're taking it so lightly, right? Oh, I'm so sorry that false teaching is such a burden. You have to wake up early, God forbid. Whereas whenever Ozem responds, he's like, I'm sorry that it's such a burden. And for him, it's like he's actually meaning it in a literal sense. Like, this thing is burdening you to such a degree that you can't just let it go. And once again, you understand both perspectives, right? I think that this conversation was just a very clever one. And then we cut to Atticus following from behind.
Of course.
So yeah, what did you think about that entire interaction with the Pharisees?
Yeah, I think they had a good conversation. Like you were saying, it's cool that they don't make all of the bad people like people that are like twiddling their thumbs in the corner. Like, they're making fair points that, I mean, conversations that you would probably have. You know what I mean? Like, it's not something where you immediately look at them and you're like, well, there's an obvious answer to that, and that's wrong, and you can point out all the flaws and all of that. Like, there's genuine questions they ask or things that they propose that you have to sit there and think about. And so I like that. That just shows that they do a really good job at characterization. So.
Well, and I've even thought about this from the perspective of the writers. Like, whenever you're writing a scene like this, it'd be very easy to just write lazy conversation that gets from point A to point B to get back to what people might consider the more interesting stuff. But they take their time with this. And to me, some of the conversations between the Pharisees are some of the more interesting stuff, because that's the stuff you can just break down in, like, because they're usually having, like, religious conversations and, like, theological debates. Which is, like, this is stuff that me and my friends talk about.
Exactly.
Right? Like, this stuff that we talk about. Stuff that our group talks about. And yes, the Pharisees are the bad guys. But really, the Pharisees probably align most closely with Christian doctrine than anybody else. That's why Jesus was getting onto them so much. Because they were so close, they were just missing the heart behind it. And so I really like that. Like, there's so much where they could just be really lazy with this. And they could just be like, oh yeah, we gotta go take down Jesus. And, like, this conversation could have literally just been them debating about how to take Jesus down. But instead, you have them actually just debating about, like, should they be doing this? Why? Like, what should their heart be behind this? And, like, they're quoting the same words back and forth to one another to point out that even the same word can be interpreted differently depending on who it's directed at. And I like that. Like, that's really clever writing. And so, like, stuff like that is the highlight of the show to me. Even beyond some of the, even stuff where the Bible's being adapted. I really just like clever writing. And that's just in any show. And then we cut back to Jesus, and once again, it's morning time now, and he's teaching people. He talks about the two sons with different responses. You know, the one who says to his father he's going to do something, then he doesn't do it, and then the one who says he's not going to do it, but then he does it. And they say, and he says, which one is the son who was obedient? And they're like, the first one. I kind of flipped the order there, but it's the one who says he wasn't going to do it, but then he did it. And so they all the first one, which once again, it reminds me of like an elementary classroom or something like that. And then Andrew goes around and he sees this guy eating food and he asks the man about food. And it's funny because the man, like, he's just saying, oh, yeah, I heard there was a fight going on here, so I came to watch. I was like, what a man thing to say.
Yeah.
And then, this is good. I don't remember if I made this prediction on the video, the spoiler video we did for episode 7, or if I just said this, like, later on.
I think you said it later on, but I could have been wrong.
But if I didn't say it in the spoiler video, I at least at some point told Brienne, I was like, oh, it'd be so cool if Telemachus, the kid from episode 7, ended up being the kid to bring the food. And that was what it was.
Yeah.
And I was like,
oh, you said it whenever we were driving back for getting food. That's whenever you said it. But I'm here to confirm. I'm here to confirm that he said it before.
But we need 2 or 3 witnesses.
Oh.
That's a bummer.
Yeah. Dang.
It's all right. Y'all can be our pseudo witnesses, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. You witnessed the fact that she testified that it was true.
Yeah,
so
there we go.
that'll hold up in court of law.
Oh, definitely.
So Telemachus says that he has food. It's not much, but he wanted to do what he could. And then we cut to Jesus, and he's sharing more parables. And I thought it was interesting. He shares a lot of the parables in this episode that we see from the Testament TV show. Yeah, like because he shares the parable of the sower. Yeah, parable of the sower, parable of the hidden treasure.
Yep.
And I was like, oh, that's funny. Like, if you don't know what the Testament show is, it's a show that's currently being crowdfunded on Angel Studios, and it's retelling the. Wow, this feels like an advertisement. It's not an advertisement. I just wanted to share it.
Yeah.
But it is a show that's retelling the story of the Book of Acts, but in a modern day. And it's actually really cool because they released a movie that's called Testament, The Parables Retold.
Yeah.
And I actually got to do a kind of like interview quiz thing with the director and the writer. So it was actually really fun. It's on this channel. But yeah, they have a bunch of parables throughout there, and some of the ones Jesus shared today were from that. So
and I think that
cool.
in one of the other episodes, he talked about the parable of like the talents.
Oh, yeah.
They talked about that in one of the other episodes. I think whenever they've been gathered many times, but whenever all the disciples were gathered with Jesus, I think they had talked about the talents at one time.
Nice.
I think.
Yeah, kind of fun.
Don't quote me on it.
Yeah. And so Jesus shares the parable of the hidden treasure, the pearl of great price, or the pearl of great value. And then he also begins to explain the parables to them, which is cool because he explains the stuff because they're like, what is this parable even about? And he begins to give an explanation that we don't find in scripture. He just explains about how it represents the kingdom of God and how the kingdom of God is worth selling everything for. And then little James, they're like the disciples have been like debating amongst themselves, like, oh, we shouldn't interrupt him. And little James kind of like awkwardly like comes up and Jesus is like, well, little James, could you not hear?
Yeah.
And little James says that there's an issue. And then Jesus sees everybody debating and he's like, all right, guys, just excuse me for a second.
Yeah.
I don't know why. Something that was super entertaining about this episode to me was just like watching Jesus like handling a crowd.
Yeah.
And just seeing like how
I'll be back.
Yeah, seeing how the creators of the show like depicted Jesus like handling stuff, because I don't know, like I think it's funny to me because he wasn't necessarily the most charismatic person.
Yeah. Like
that's what I liked. Because like it wasn't like, this guy being like, oh, sorry guys, my decide, like he was kind of awkward about stuff. He's like, I'll be right back. You know, like I thought that was good because Jesus, like people love him for his teaching, but he's not necessarily like the most charismatic person in the world, and he's not used to handling a crowd, and his goal was not to be popular. He's just popular,
Yeah.
I thought that was cool.
Which is kind of cool because it talks about like in the Gospels, it talks about like him wanting to get away from crowds and not necessarily like always liking crowds and stuff like that, and so that kind of like plays into it in an underhand type way. So, anyways.
Yeah, I don't mean to brag, but there was this one page that I went on where like they did like I don't know how people did this, but they did the Myers-Briggs test for like all of the different, like just a bunch of different Bible characters. Like I guess they were just trying to say like from what we know about the Bible characters, they like took the test and like they had a list, and on one, I think there's multiple things like this, and people like had different ones for each of them because obviously we don't know. Right. But I remember that most of the lists I saw had Jesus as INFJ or INTJ.
Oh, I remember you looking.
And I've taken the Myers-Briggs things twice, and I have landed at INFJ and INTJ. So,
oh gosh,
I'm just saying, I am also a more introverted person, and I think me and Jesus might have had a very similar personality.
And moving on, our next point is...
I'm just kidding, no. But I had to bring that up because I've always related to that. Like, Jesus, like, he has like this long day of ministry and he just like passes out on the boat. Or like, he's just like constantly like waking up early or staying up late just to like get away from people. I'm like, I get
Well, that's like him at the end of the thing. He's like, and speaking of, like, rest,
I
I'm
need
tired and
rest.
you're tired.
Yeah,
We need to go to bed.
Yeah. And so Jesus tells the apostles to give them something to eat, and they're all really confused because they're like, how are we supposed to do that? And it's funny because Judas is like, you knew they were hungry? And Jesus is like, yes, Judas. I can see that when I'm talking.
Yeah, I love that part.
I just love it because Judas is like, dang, I feel stupid.
Yeah.
And then the disciples debate on a way to solve the problem, and they're all listing different things. They're like, oh, we could run into town. We could do this. We could do that. And then Andrew comes up, and he's like, hey, I got food. And it's 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's like, well, that's not going to do very much, is it?
Or so they think.
Yeah. And so Simon says that he'll take care of it if he wants to, because this is whenever they all point out, oh, Simon was crucial to this. And Simon's just, once again, he's just disengaged.
Yeah.
And a very interesting creative choice to have Simon disengaged throughout this entire miracle, right? But he's just not focused on it. He is not here for it. He says Jesus will take care of it if he wants to. Very dark place. Like, this dude is like if I were seeing Simon acting like this, I would be like sitting him down and talking, be like, dude, like, because it seems kind of suicidal to me. Like, just the way he's talking, it seems so detached and like emotionless and devoid of like hope.
Yeah.
I would be genuinely concerned if I saw like a friend like this. Yeah. But he says he'll take care of it if he wants to. And then John says that Simon looks afraid. So John is noticing stuff.
Yeah.
And then this is where you get to see insight to Simon's perspective. Once again, he says, I'm afraid that he'll choose them. So for Simon, it's not about Jesus loving and caring for others. It's about him choosing others over him. Yeah. And he says, like, he's going to provide for them, but he didn't provide for me. Which is, once again, a terrible mindset to be in. But I wouldn't be surprised. I think a lot of Christians would relate to that. Because I think a lot of Christians, they have a difficult time not thinking of things that way. Yeah. It's also the story of Jonah, right? That's kind of the whole message there as well. And so then Jesus blesses the food, and he puts it in the basket, and then he tells the group to organize everybody in like 50s and 100s and get the baskets and feed them. And then I like this. Thomas turns to Jesus and says, this seems familiar. And Jesus says, maybe. And they kind of laugh about it because this is a callback to season 1, right? The, turning water to wine. Yeah. Thomas is like,
I see what's going on here.
Yeah, he's not quite doubting Thomas here, is he? Yeah. He's actually kind of excited. Yeah. And so Jesus goes out to the crowd, and while the disciples are over there, like, splitting everybody up and everything. Yeah. Jesus tells everybody the parable of the mustard seed. So once again, mustard seed count up to 2 in this episode. And then you have the disciples cutting up all the stuff and filling up their baskets, and they're like, oh, we're out of food. And then they go back, and the baskets are full. And they're like, oh, crud. And then Jesus, everybody's excited except for Simon. Jesus says, I've been giving you spiritual food this the last few days. Now it's time for some actual food. Let's eat! And everybody starts cheering. And then we see this like montage of the apostles distributing the food. Yeah. My question for you, how did you like them portraying this miracle? Like, this is like obviously the thing that this whole season's been building up to. What do you think about it?
I think they did a good job. I liked the part whenever they all, like, I think it was Andrew specifically that they focused on. He, like, picked up his basket and realized it was heavier. Yeah. And I liked the eye contact, like, the exchange that they all had with Jesus. Because Jesus was back up at the front, in front of the crowd, talking. And they just kind of, like, looked over to him. And he kind of, like, gave him a smirk and, like, head nodded. And so I thought it was pretty cool.
He just needs to...
Yeah, I got y'all, don't worry. Yeah. So I think they did a good job with it.
Okay, follow-up question. Yeah. How does it compare to how maybe you've pictured this feeding of the 5,000 in your head? Because this is one of those things where, to me, inevitably, whenever you watch a show like this, stuff like this gets brought up. I typically try not to do it, but this is one of those places where I've always pictured it in my head one way. Not saying that that's how it happened, but I was going into this, I was wondering how they were going to depict it, and it is different than how I expected it. So how do you typically picture it, and how does that hold up there?
I would say for like most of my life, like growing up and stuff, whenever I used to hear the story, I imagined it multiplying as they were handing it out, like not multiplying before it was given to them. Why? That's the way I always pictured it. I don't know. Yeah. But that's the way I always thought of it, like growing up, is that it was like multiplying as they handed it out.
Okay. Which, to be fair, that might be kind of what was going on, because they only had like 12 baskets there, and so it probably like it seems like every time they returned, more was showing up or something. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting.
Anyways,
yeah. For me, I mean, mine, like, we have no reason to believe this. Like, we know very little details about the whole thing, right? So how they depicted it here is totally plausible. But for me, for some reason, I think maybe just because I like just like more like spectacle stuff, I always like pictured it like just being like this weird trippy thing where like Jesus is like breaking the bread, and like it's almost like a magic trick. It probably was not this way. It's like how they did it here is probably much more realistic to how it took place. But for some reason, I always pictured it to where it's like he like breaks it and like turns the food at an angle, and like instead of there being one loaf, there's two. And then he breaks it, and there's three, and it's like, what? And then like he's just like dealing it all out, and he's like breaking the bread, and he like puts it in the basket, and then like all of a sudden there's a full loaf still in his hands. Like I don't know. That's probably not how it was, because that would be very, like, he'd be really busy. Like, he wouldn't be able to teach that whole time. He'd just be, like, distributing stuff, and by the end, he'd be super tired. Yeah. So how they did it here is probably more realistic to how it would happen. Yeah. And it requires less of, like, a budget. I just thought it was really funny. Yeah. And I remember that there was, like, some parody thing about Jesus. Like, one thing, it was, like, it was not a Christian show. I think it was, like, about Jesus, like, it's probably something kind of blasphemous, honestly. This was, like, a long time ago. I was, like, in high school or something, and I had seen this. But it was, like, a joke. And it was like making fun of the feeding of 5,000 thing, and it was like it was almost like that, where it's like you saw one fish from one angle, and then he like turns it, and then there's two, and you're like, what? And he turns it, and there's three, and I was like, oh, it's kind of funny. But I just wanted to ask how you pictured it, because I've never really thought about. I don't think I realized I had that in my head. Yeah. Until I was watching it unfold, I was like, oh, that's different than how I expected it. But yeah, and then everybody's like distributing stuff, and then you get this one lingering thing about Judas just being like, whoa, that was awesome. Yeah. And he's probably gonna be like, yo, so why do you need a treasurer if you can just produce food out of nothing? I know, yeah. Which is really just amazing in regards to Jesus' power, right? The fact that he has the ability to do this stuff, yet he just actively doesn't do it all the time. Amazing. And then we cut to Yusuf, and he's being visited by Eden and her mother, and this scene was super impactful, but I think Eden only says one word the entire time. I think she just says the word yes whenever he asks her if she's mad. Yeah. I'm trying to remember if she said anything else. It's mainly her mother who does the talking here. I think so, yeah. And it's kind of cool because Yusuf's like, it's not visiting hours. That's like Josiah's turn right now. Which is kind of funny. Yeah. Because Yusuf's just doing his own studying, but then he figures out, it's like followers of Jesus. Yeah. And he's like, bring him on in. Like, he's like, I want to know about this. And then Yusuf counsels her. He consoles her for Simon's distraction. And I thought he offered some pretty fair perspective about stuff. He said, hey, the world is upending with Simon in the middle of it. Yeah. Which I think is something that Eden recognizes, but probably still needs to be reminded of more and more. Because it's like, yeah, I know what you're going through is tough, but Simon is literally in the middle of something like unprecedented. Yeah. Like this is, like, if he seems distracted, rightfully so. I mean, he's walking around with God in the flesh. I mean, Yusuf doesn't fully know that, but he at least gets to see the effect of it. And Yusuf even says, like, I don't know what to make of this stuff. And so I think that it's we just need to recognize that. Like, what Simon and the disciples are going through here is totally remarkable. Like, imagine that you realized that your new best friend was God in the flesh. You'd probably be very distracted by stuff, right? And if you were hanging out with him for a few months and he gave you or if you left for a few months and he gave you the ability to perform his own actions and you came home, you probably would forget to ask your wife how she was doing.
Yeah. Like, I need to debrief. Yeah.
And so I think that Yusuf provides good counsel here. He asks if she is angry with Simon, and this is where she just admits yes. And I don't think that she's saying it's logical or anything like that. I think she just is being honest and says, yes, I am angry. And that doesn't mean that the emotion is logical at all. It's just how it is. She says she is angry. He asks her if she is cleansed in the mikvah. And they mention that the cistern has been messed up. Yeah. But he says, well, the cistern's been fixed. And Simon helped. And I thought that was kind of cool. Like, just like, so in a way, without even realizing it, Simon was providing for his wife. Yeah. You know, it's like, oh, that's kind of neat. And then Ema requests, I don't know.
The mom's name. Yeah.
It wasn't like Elisheva, was it?
Oh, I don't know.
For some reason, that name sounds really familiar to me. Elisheva. No, Elisheva, that's Matthew's mom's name. Oh. Sorry. I was like, sorry to search. Sounds familiar, but I don't think that's that was Matthew's mom's name. Ema, that's just the Hebrew name for mom. Yeah. I don't remember what her name is here, but she asks that something be read from the Torah, And they use Torah just to reference the entire Old Testament scriptures. Technically, Torah is just the law, but it could also be used for the entire Tanakh, right? Yeah. And so she requests that there be a reading from the Torah, and she suggests something uplifting. And I like that Yusuf says, I don't know if that'd be as helpful. Because usually that's not very helpful, right? I mean, you're going through something tough. You probably don't want to hear the most uplifting stuff. Sometimes you need to hear that. But Yusuf, rightly, he takes them to a dark psalm. Yeah. But like the psalms typically do, there's a twist, right? And it turns, and usually it turns around God's hesed, right? Yeah. And so I thought that was pretty good. And he quotes Psalm 77, which is the psalm that we read at the beginning of this episode. Yes. And he points out that this song is a song that is desperate and angry. And he says that, I think you're desperate and angry right now, but do you know who else is? Simon. And I thought that was good. Like, Yusuf is looking at this from all angles. And even as he's counseling Eden, he's reminding her of what Simon's going through as well, right. Which is a very good thing. Like, he's not giving her just a pity party to where she feels like the victim. And that's how counseling goes sometimes. Like, counseling is like, ooh, let me see you and your problems and make it seem like everybody else is the bad guy. No, it's like, okay, yes, I want to be here for you and your problems, but we also need to take a more holistic view of everybody else. And then he suggests that she pray this psalm both with Simon and for Simon, which is really cool. So what did you think about that entire little scene right there?
I like how Yusuf handled the situation. I thought it was cool that Simon and Eden were not there together, but the way that Yusuf was talking to Eden, it was understanding her feelings and what was going on, but it was also like making amends in their marriage. Like, it was tying them back together almost without both of them even being present in that moment. Yeah. Just by things that Yusuf was saying to Eden, you could tell that was like bringing their bond closer together, and it was shedding off some of those different emotions, so that they can start to make amends towards one another once they come back together. Yeah. Which I thought was really cool, because they weren't even in the same room.
Yeah. So. Well, and to go off what you're saying, it's actually really cool what the writers did, because they are being brought back together, and basically from this point forward through the rest of the episode, everything Eden is going through, Simon is going through too.
It's so good.
Like, literally starting here, like for the rest of the episode, every time Eden shows up on screen, it'll cut back and forth from her to Simon.
A parallel, yeah.
Because there'll be a parallel, because now they're separated from one another, but they are going through it together. Yeah. And that's really cool, right? So, and Yusuf is the one who does this. Like, that's so neat, like, to have Yusuf as the catalyst to bring them together.
Well, not even, yes, Yusuf, but not even that, just seeing how, like, it's the word of God that does
Scripture,
it. Like, it's the psalm. He reads the psalm, and yes, Yusuf is saying that to her, but it's the psalm that's doing it, which is really cool. Just because, I don't know, it just points back to the strength of marriage and having God in the center of it, and how they've been separate for so long and they haven't been able to see eye to eye, and all of a sudden you read a psalm and it's this super sad, depressing psalm, but yet the word of God brings this marriage back together, and it's just beautiful.
Yeah, even though Simon hasn't even heard it yet.
Exactly.
But no, that's good point. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. Good stuff. So as she lemons. I can't talk. We filmed so many videos today. I mean, and I've got to film another one later. This is gonna be wild. I'm so tired already. Speaking of rest, let me rest. So as she listens, Simon is distributing the food, right? So we're cutting back and forth between them. And then we see that Simon is going around and he's trying to get people's attention, and he comes across this woman with her child. And this makes him thoughtful. And once again, we don't know what's going on in his mind. The actor plays it super well.
He does.
He just kind of looks off into the distance. And throughout all this, Yusuf is reading the psalm out loud, right? It's in the narration throughout this.
Yeah.
And then we get to the turning point in the psalm, right? Where all of a sudden, rather than complaining against God, the psalmist praises God, right? And really you realize that he wasn't complaining against God. He was complaining about his situations to God. And then he turns to God and says, your way is holy. What God is great like our God? And that's what I love about the Psalms, is that typically whenever we go through hardship, our go-to is to like accuse God or doubt his goodness or his strength. Whereas typically in the Psalms, rather than doubting his goodness and strength, it's those two things which the psalmist relies on. To where he's like, instead of doubting you, I'm going to rely that you are good, you are strong. And that's what Eden's having to go through. And she starts breaking down here, which I just think was really cool.
Yeah.
And through all of this, eventually they all are just like super impressed by everything. and they gather together, and I love it. Judas is amazed, and Matthew walks up and he's like, "You're gonna get used to this kind of math, Judas."
Yeah.
And Matthew, he just gets so giddy. Like, back in season 1, at the beginning of season 2, he was so like uncomfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But now he just gets excited that things aren't conforming to his logical brain.
Mm-hmm.
And he literally says, "I am no longer surprised." Yeah. It's like, it's so funny. I just love it. And then Jesus says, "I was the one who made them hungry. Shouldn't I satisfy it?" And I don't know why. I don't know if this is what the writers were intending, but that comment made me start thinking about an argument that C.S. Lewis has for the existence of God. And he calls it the argument from desire. And it's really not the strongest argument when it comes to apologetics, but it's the idea that every single one of us has this longing for something that provides lasting joy and love and peace. Yeah. And that longing itself testifies to the existence of that thing. Once again, it'll break down in many places, but C.S. Lewis's argument, it says, like he says, we would not hunger for food if food didn't exist, because we would just exist in a perpetual state of hunger, and we would never know what food was. We would never know there was a satisfaction for it. Or we would never really know what tiredness was if there was no sleep, because we would be tired, but we wouldn't know what that meant, because there was nothing to remedy it, right? And so C.S. Lewis's argument was, if I'm hungry, then food must exist. If I'm thirsty, then drink must exist. If I'm sleepy, then sleep must exist. And if I long for eternity, and if I long for love and joy and peace, then something that can provide those things must exist. Once again, that breaks down, because I might long for a unicorn to exist. That doesn't mean a unicorn exists. But C.S. Lewis is addressing the fact that longing for a unicorn and longing for love are two vastly different things, right? No, like, longing for a unicorn is a wishful dream. Love is something that every single human craves, just like food. And so it kind of made me think of that, because he says, I'm the one who made them hungry. Shouldn't I satisfy it? And that applies both physically and spiritually, right? Like, God is the one who made us hungry, right? He is the one who put that craving within us, but he's also the only one who can satisfy it. And I just thought that was kind of cool, because I'm like, oh, that's a good little comment, which I don't know if they were intending it that way, but that's how I took it.
It works,
so,
yeah.
And this is where Simon, he just walks up and he kind of throws a temper tantrum. Yeah. And he just like throws his basket on the ground and storms off. Yeah. And John's about to pursue after him, and Big James stops him, and Jesus and them are all like, okay.
Way to put a damper on.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, like, what a buzzkill, you know? Like, they're all so excited, and Simon is just
not happy. Not happening.
Yeah, it's not looking good, but it's also consistent with Simon's character that he would be like this, and we're all like this, you know? Like, God can be something amazing, and we're so focused on ourselves that we are just no good. Yeah. Right? And at the beginning of this season, I was on Simon's side a little bit, but now how he's acting right now is inexcusable. Like, bro, like, you need to get your act together. And I say that at the same time. I've been like this. But the Pharisees arrive and they disembark. Also, did you want to say anything else about, like, that entire scene?
No.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Just so y'all know, I asked.
He does ask.
Yes.
He does ask. Don't worry. I know I can say stuff whenever I want to.
Yeah, she can always cut in whenever she wants. I've told her that.
Yeah.
Don't get at me. Like, don't get on to me because she doesn't talk. I'm a more talkative person, okay? Yeah. Back off. So the Pharisees arrive and they disembark. And the Syrophoenicians come and they tell them all about this miracle. And really the Pharisees, their main goal is like, we need 2 or 3 witnesses. And this is where Ozim starts getting upset. And Ozim, once he hears what's going on, he's the one who starts taking this very seriously. Whereas once Shmuel hears it, he seems more just like thrown off because of how big the crowd is. Yeah. And Ozim says, Jews and Gentiles eating together? And they're upset. And the man, he just marks off. It's kind of funny. He says, I tell them God performed a miracle, and they say I ate with the wrong people, or he ate with the wrong people. And it's like, that's a fair criticism, you know? I mean, it's like, God's doing this amazing thing, and they're worried about, like, the most minute details. Leander shows up, and there's their second witness. He says that Jesus preached about the kingdom of heaven, and he says that Jews and Gentiles will sit together at the table. And this is where Yanni and Ozim are totally furious. But once again, Shmuel is notably silent. And then Ozim, he says, oh man, what? Oh no, Ozim is saying to Leander, you've hurt your people, right? Like, you've hurt the Jewish people by allowing this to happen. And then Leander responds, I had a typo here in my notes. And then Leander responds to Ozim and says, no, you're hurting our people. he's healing us. Right? And I thought that was good because that's the second time that we've had this. Formerly, it was Ozim who was quoting back at Shmuel, right? Shmuel had said, I'm sorry that false prophecy is such a burden to you. And then Ozim says, I'm sorry it's such a burden to you. Now Ozim is telling Leander, you've hurt our people. And Leander says, you've hurt our people. And I like that idea, like, two people saying the same thing, but it means two different things going back and forth.
Yeah.
I thought it was cool. And then Shmuel seems shaken up. We're about to talk about it more, but what do you think about Shmuel and what's going on in his head during all this?
I think his character is really cool. I mean, and I think that it's cool how there's different characters in different positions. Like, Shmuel is almost like in the same position, I think, is like what Gaius is.
Okay.
Like, with there seems to be like a softening of his heart. And you don't quite know, like, where it is or what exactly he possibly is thinking, but you can tell he's questioning stuff and he's taking stuff from both sides and different perspectives more than other people around him.
Yeah, Shmuel's complicated because he's the one who has really set in motion all this opposition to Jesus, right? He's the one who went down to Jerusalem. He's set all this stuff in motion. The reason Yanni and Ozim are here is because of him. But in this episode especially, he does seem shaken up, and it seems like he's almost coming to like the end of himself, where it's almost like, it seems like in these final scenes here, he's beginning to realize that maybe it wasn't false prophecy that he was mad about, right? And I think some of the different comments that have been made here, even Ozim's, right? I'm sorry, false prophecy is such a burden to you. Little comments like that, it seems like they're working on Shmuel to where he's beginning to realize that maybe he wasn't just mad at Jesus. Maybe he had something else that, and that we're going to see that whenever he confronts Jesus, he's going to kind of admit what the problem is that he feels like he's losing everything, right? He was the big guy in town. Like, he was the Pharisee of Capernaum. Jesus comes in and steals his popularity. Yeah. And now Jesus has these crowds. And I think the issue is that Shmuel wanted to be that, right? He wanted to be the new Nicodemus, right? That goes back to season 1. Whereas here, I think he's beginning to realize, oh, like, this is a heart issue. And then whenever Jesus confronts him, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's like, he realizes this is just a good guy. Like, he's not like he's invited me to come pray with him and stuff. So it's just, really, really fascinating. We cut to Simon paying some people for a boat. And for a second, I didn't understand what was going on here. I thought he'd rushed all the way back to the hometown and he was like buying a boat and he was going to go back to fishing. And I was like, what the heck? I was like, bro.
That took a turn.
But then I noticed that the storm was gathering, and rather than being shocked, I was shocked in a better way. Yeah. Because they did it. They did the thing I didn't think they were going to do, but they did it. And Simon tells them that they are going to row across the water because they could get across the sea faster because it's only like 8 miles. That's what he says. So they're going to do something exciting, which I didn't expect them to do, but they did it. Jesus says that he'll meet them over there, but he needs to go off and pray for a little bit, and he tells them to follow Simon. And John tells Simon to just have faith. Simon says faith isn't the problem. He thinks he was a mistake. And he makes this really weird comment. He says, even God makes mistakes, right? That was just a weird comment to me. Yeah. Because that does not seem like something that Simon or any Jew would say.
Yeah, even with him not being, like, in the right frame of mind, I still wouldn't imagine him saying that. You know? Like, it seems even odd, even though we know he's very off right now.
Yeah, like, it's just a very odd comment to make. And he's speaking more from emotion than, like, theology, but it was just a weird thing to make, because, like, if you think that God can make a mistake, faith is definitely an issue. And I think that's the point. The point is that faith was an issue. Yeah. He was just thinking of faith in the wrong way, right? Because he was thinking of faith in a cognitive sense, but the issue is that it's cognitive dissonance. That's what's going on here, right? Because he says he believes that Jesus is who he claims to be. He just doesn't really trust in Jesus' will. But at the same time, he's like, yeah, but God makes mistakes. I'm like, oh, that's not correct. Yeah. And I don't think anybody, like, I don't even think, like, the most devout Christian, like you can ask anybody, and I don't think they'd outright say, yeah, God makes mistakes. I think by their actions, they might portray that, right? Like, so Simon is living in such a way that suggests that he thinks God made a mistake. But if somebody were to directly ask him, I would not expect him to admit to that, if that makes sense. Right? Like, there's a lot of people where just the way they conduct themselves, I'm like, okay, you think that you know better than God, and therefore you think God's making a mistake. But if you ask them, they would not admit that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So maybe Simon's just being honest here, and he's like, he's just being consistent, and I don't know. But that was kind of weird to me. And so then we cut to Shmuel, and he comes across Jesus, and Jesus is standing there. It's almost like Jesus was waiting for him.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus just smiles at him. And Jesus says that he looks familiar. And Shmuel seems kind of confused by this. And Jesus says, well, it's because you look troubled. And Shmuel says that he is troubled. And Jesus invites him to come pray with him, which I thought was kind of cool. Like, I want to come pray with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And Shmuel, well, because Jesus says we don't even have to talk. Sometimes it's nice to just, like, be troubled with somebody there.
Yeah.
And Shmuel says, like Job? And Jesus says, yes. And Shmuel's like, I don't feel like Job. I feel more like David. And he starts quoting Psalm 13 because, and this is where we get to see Shmuel being very self-aware and recognizing why it is that he doesn't like Jesus. Because Psalm 13 is David voicing his concern about his enemies being exalted over him. And so he's standing face to face with Jesus and he's saying, I see these crowds around me. And that's why I'm feeling like David, because he's like, he feels like he is the righteous one who deserves the glory. And that's not what David meant in Psalm 13 either.
Yeah.
But this is, you know, a Pharisee reading himself into it, right?
Yeah.
Shmuel identifies himself as the righteous one suffering, while Jesus is this wicked person going out here bringing in all the crowds. And he views Jesus as an enemy who's being exalted, and therefore he feels like David there. I thought that was so fascinating. What did you think about that?
No, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how that's not how you actually read the psalm, but you have to take it from the perspective of Shmuel and like being a Pharisee and how he is reading himself into it, which was interesting. Yeah,
because whenever David's talking about it, he literally is like in a place where he is the righteous one suffering, and his wicked enemy is being exalted, and he's like, God, what the heck? But this is how
the wicked enemy is Jesus.
Yeah,
which is like not the case.
But this is how a Pharisee would feel.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. And he's frustrated by it. And I think what Shmuel is realizing is that his issue isn't really as much with Jesus as it is with his own lack of the glory that Jesus has taken away from him.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Jesus, he just shows up and immediately starts growing in popularity.
Yeah.
And he becomes the new Nicodemus, right? Yeah. I mean, he's drawing crowds Nicodemus never drew. And meanwhile, Shmuel, he's still getting ridiculed by the Pharisees in Jerusalem. Yeah. And he's setting these things in motion, and the people aren't even impressed by him. They're still criticizing him. Yeah. And then they just take over the whole Jesus thing.
Yeah.
And so I think Shmuel's just recognizing that maybe his heart was in the wrong place. And I don't know where they're going to head with this. I don't know if he's going to repent. For all I know, Shmuel could end up being Saul of Tarsus, and he's going to eventually be Paul. I have no idea what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Probably not, because Shmuel is Samuel, not Saul.
Yeah.
But I just think that, I don't know, I thought it was a very interesting thing for them to include here, because he was the one who started off this whole, like, he got the ball rolling, and now he's seeming to have second thoughts.
Yeah.
In a way.
And I would imagine that what makes it even, like, harder for Shmuel to, like, swallow, like, his own pride is the idea that Jesus doesn't want crowds to follow him, but Shmuel craves it so much. Yeah. And Jesus, his goal is not necessarily to grow in numbers. He's not trying to get as many people to follow him as possible. Like that is not his main motivation for going around and teaching and preaching. Because we see how there's people that don't respond. Well, not necessarily in the show, but in the Bible, we see how there's people that aren't going to respond. So he starts speaking in parables and on purpose. Yeah. So I mean, he's not his main goal is not to grow in people, and we see that Shmuel really craves that. And now there's this Jesus dude that just comes in the block, and he's just like getting all these people, and he's not necessarily wanting this huge crowd to follow him. And he rejects the crowds at times, and he goes and hides away in houses, and he goes away to his lonely places, as Matthew would say. Yeah. To be away from to be away from the crowds. And Shmuel is like, this is like, I want this popularity, I want this recognition, and you just come in here and you take it away from me. You take it away from me, but then also you take it so easily without even necessarily having to put in a lot of effort. Yeah. So.
Which is a very familiar feeling that a lot of people would probably have.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why it makes it so surprising what Jesus says. Because Jesus says you're losing something, And he's like, I'm losing everything. But then Jesus says, I'm losing something as well. And just in how Shmuel responds, the actor plays it so well. Because he says, what are you losing?
Yeah.
Like, to where, like, that almost is more telling than everything. Because from his perspective, he's like, what could you possibly be losing?
It seems like he's gaining everything.
He says, you are gaining everything I've always wanted.
Yeah.
And then Jesus responds and says, time. And this is something that, I think this is how the season 3 trailer opened up. Right? Like, the first trailer for this season opened up with this interaction between him and Shmuel. I didn't realize it was going to come from the finale, just a few minutes before the end. But he says, I'm running out of time. And we don't really see Shmuel's reaction that much, because Jesus just changes the subject. But obviously he's alluding to his crucifixion, right? I mean, in the show, we're halfway there, right? So he will be dead by the end of season 6. So we're literally halfway there. He is losing time. But then he invites Shmuel to come with him and pray, and Jesus just turns and walks off. And then Shmuel hesitates, and then it seems like he follows. Yeah. But we never see what they talk about. No. But Shmuel does ask, he says, will I get to talk to you afterwards? And Jesus says, absolutely. But we don't know what happened there. Yeah. We don't know what's going to go on. Wait, look.
I'm excited to see what happens from
I know. Because next time we see Jesus, he is doing something that I did not expect us to see in this show. But I'm so glad. Yeah. And also, the theme song is so glad that they showed. Because now, what we cut to is the disciples. And they are in the middle of a huge storm. I love that you put that in all caps. Yes, I put it in all caps in my notes. Huge storm! Because this was a big deal to me. I don't know why. I had heard somewhere, I could have sworn Dallas said somewhere that they were not going to depict this.
I thought I remember him saying that too.
And
just
maybe they
didn't want to take people out of it or something.
And maybe they changed their mind. Yeah. Or maybe people complained enough, they're like, we'll put it in there. Yeah. But it couldn't have been something they just changed the season, because it turns out that this whole season was building up to this moment. Yeah. Right? Fantastic.
It's great.
It's great. And I should have seen it coming. Whenever he says, like, this whole thing depends on Simon.
Should have, yeah.
Whatever. Okay. I was dumb.
You realized it at the beginning of the episode, because you had said it to me. Remember? Did I? Yeah, you turned to me, like, it was like halfway through the episode or something, and you're like, what if it's gonna lead to walking on water? What if it's gonna be Simon? Like, you said that.
Oh, heck yeah.
To me. Yeah, before it happened.
Boom. Killed it. Wow, that hurt my arm. I hurt my arm a few days ago, and that didn't feel good. Okay. Yes, I did.
You did.
Let's go. So, I didn't see it at the beginning of the season, but I did see it before it happened. Episode. Yeah. Yeah, so we see this huge storm going on, and this is something I'm so excited for, because, like, this is such a big moment in scripture, and I'm glad that they showed it. So, first off, this confused me, because you see them rowing, and then they see something in the distance. Yeah. And then it cuts to Atticus.
And I was like, what?
And I thought, like, wait, did they just see Atticus? Yeah. But, like, because John's the one who sees it.
Atticus is on the shore, and it didn't seem like they were that close to shore to see him.
Well, yeah, and, like, the silhouette, what they saw, it seemed really big.
I know, yeah.
And then, like John's like, what was that? And then it immediately cuts to Atticus, and I was like, maybe they're not going to do it. I was like, maybe that was just, like, a bait and switch, and, like, they're just going to get to the other side. But then they cut back. I'm like, okay, maybe not. But it's just showing that, once again, Atticus is seeing this stuff going on.
Yeah.
Right?
He's in the back.
And it shows that, man, they've been rowing for so long, and Atticus can still see them from the shoreline. Yeah. Which is really embarrassing. Like, especially if they've got 8 miles to go. Like, he can still see them. That's not good. So there's a huge storm. John thinks he saw something, and then all of a sudden they are freaking out. And I liked how they depicted this. Because you always think it seems kind of silly whenever you're reading it in the Bible. And they're like, oh, it's a ghost. And you're like, oh, come on, guys. But, like...
It's all rainy and foggy and smoky.
Yeah, and you just kind of see Jesus, like, it's like a silhouette at first. Yeah. And, like, I'd be freaking out. I mean... Yeah.
Jesus... Your first thing would be like, oh my gosh, there's someone walking on water.
Exactly.
Like...
I mean, Jesus he's, like, healed dead people. Like, he's raised dead people. He has multiplied food and stuff. Walking on water is just, like, that's a different thing, right? Yeah. I mean, you can turn water to wine.
You're defying, like, that's...
Walking on water... That does not make sense. No. Right? Like, he is literally treating water like it's dry ground. That's crazy. And so I can understand them being like, oh, this is not good. Like, this is a ghost. We're heading to Sheol or something. I don't know what's going to happen. But then Simon, or is it, one of them recognizes it first. Like, I'm trying to figure out who it was.
That was Andrew.
Andrew? Was it Andrew?
I thought it was.
Because somebody's like, wait a second, it's him.
I thought it was Andrew, because he was, Andrew's up towards the front.
Okay, maybe it was Andrew.
But it was dark, and they were panning between a lot of them, so I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But I thought it was him up at the front.
And then one of them, I think it's Big James or something, or Thomas, he's like, would it be surprising if I said this is only the second most impressive thing I've seen today? Yeah. I'm like, bro, what? You might have seen him feed a lot of people. This is more impressive.
Yeah, walking on water.
I mean, like, this is pretty crazy. Like, don't downplay it. Like, it's just kind of weird thing for me to, like, there's a weird line to put in there, because you're seeing, like, probably the most spectacular miracle that we've seen thus far in the show.
Yeah.
And, like, they have characters in the show actively downplaying the moment.
Yeah.
I was like, that's kind of just a weird creative choice. Yeah. Like, I'd be like, wow, who would have thought that other thing was only the second? You know, like, there's a way to write that. It's just kind of weird.
Yeah.
But then Simon tells everybody to stop rowing. And this is where Simon, man, like, homeboy's having, like, just a crisis in the middle of the sea.
Yeah.
And obviously the entire debate between Jesus and him, that's not biblical.
Right.
They were using this as a very climactic moment, but I thought it was really cool how they just interweaved it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was just kind of neat. And Simon's like the way that he tells Jesus to invite him, it's almost different. Like, they almost recontextualize it from the Bible, right? In the Bible, it's literally Simon just being like, once again, he's almost trying to impress Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? Jesus, call me out to you. And, okay, you know, like, it's just him, like, being Simon.
Yeah.
Whereas here, it's almost like he's challenging Jesus. And he says, you want me to show you I have faith? Call me out there. I'll step out. Like, I believe. And sure enough, he does.
Mm-hmm.
But, and then, like, whenever he looks at the waves and stuff, it has even more meaning.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because typically, I mean, what they're kind of doing here is they're doing what I don't like people typically doing about, like, the walking on the water thing. Because they make it about us, right? And they're like, oh, well, sometimes when we're eyes are on Jesus, we can accomplish these amazing things. But then, like, when we look at the waves and the storm around us, we start sinking. Okay, like, I don't really like when people do that, but that's how they did it here, and I think it works with how they did it here. So Simon, like, he steps out there, and he steps out in faith, and he is walking on the water, and it's portrayed really awesomely and really cool. And then as he's walking, Simon is just voicing all of his concerns to Jesus. And I was like, all the disciples are just like, oh my gosh, this dude's going through a lot. He's voicing all of his concerns.
Well, yeah, it's not only that, but they're watching not only Jesus walking on water, but now Simon just stepped out of the boat and he's walking on water.
Yeah.
While Simon is voicing all these things, they're like, we had no idea all this was going on in his head. Simon is walking on water. Jesus is walking on the water. Is it storming right now?
Well, it's also funny because it's like, from their perspective, he has a total death wish. Because it's one thing for Jesus to walk on the water, but then they're all like, Simon, what are you doing? Like, they're actively trying to, like, hold him in the boat because they have no reason to think Simon can do this. Right? From their perspective, Simon is pulling a Jonah right now, and he's like, you know what? Just throw me overboard. And, like, Simon's about to just, like, sink to the bottom in the middle of the storm. They have no idea. But then, sure enough, Simon walks on the water. I just think that's great.
Yeah.
And this is what's so clever. As Simon steps onto the water,
so good.
Eden steps into the mikvah.
Yeah.
Right? And so, from this point forward, Simon and Eden are going through things together. They're both going through their cleansing and their purification.
Yes.
And they're both going to be submerged in the water, and Jesus is going to bring them back up, and it's really cool. And so, Simon steps in the water as Eden steps into the mikvah, and Simon says, faith hasn't been my problem. I gave up everything, but I gave up everything to follow you, but you're healing strangers. AKA, translation, faith isn't my problem, you're my problem.
Yeah.
It's a bold thing to say to Jesus.
Yeah.
But you see where he's coming from. And that does mean faith is your problem, right? Because faith goes hand in hand with trusting Jesus, right? It's not simply believing Jesus is one thing. It's trusting in who he is and trusting in his name, right? And what he represents and what his will is.
Back to the mustard seed.
Yeah. And so I thought that was really good. And Jesus responds. And I love that they're having this huge debate, like, in the middle of the storm. He says, why do you think I allow trials? It's to strengthen your faith. And he tells him to keep his eyes on him, right? Keep your eyes on me. And in the context of the show, this works really well. Because Jesus is always telling people, look at me, look at me, look at me. It's always about eye contact. Focus on me. And so he tells Simon to do the same thing here. And then Eden is submerging more into the water. And then Simon, and once again, Eden is weeping. She's going through all this stuff. And you can tell that her mind is on all the things they've been going through. And then Simon is also thinking about all the stuff they've been going through, and he looks at the storm. Right? So both of them are going through this, and they both begin to sink. In many ways, this is our first baptism of the show. Right? In a way. It's like they're dying to their old self, coming out new. Kind of cool. So Simon looks at the storm, he calls out for Jesus, and he says, Lord, I'm sinking! And so he was here accusing Jesus of not caring. but as soon as he begins to sink, he calls out to Jesus, knowing that Jesus will take care of him. Right? And so that was really cool. Like, the only way for Simon to recognize Jesus did care was to be pushed to the point where he genuinely was desperate and he was on the brink of death. Right? And he says, Lord, help me, I'm sinking. On one hand, he, like, moments before, he's literally walking on water, accusing Jesus of not caring. But as he begins to sink, Jesus is the person he calls out to. I'm like, that's really cool. Like, that was just very well done. And then Jesus, this is one of those moments, like, I might have talked about how the feeding of the 5,000 was different than how I depicted it. This is exactly how I always pictured it. Yeah, you know, like, you're just waiting, you're like, okay, they have to have that epic shot with Jesus' hand, like, reaching through. And practically speaking, I want to see how Jesus was standing up on top. Because, like, the angle that his hand was at, like, it was kind of a weird angle, but it's how I've always pictured it in my head, so I'll allow it. Because Simon was pretty deep in there. But Jesus reaches down, he grabs him, and then Simon and Eden emerge from the water at the same time. It's beautiful. It's really cool. And then Simon just hugs onto Jesus. Like, he's almost like kneeling on the water. I know, It's kind of funny. Like, who knew about that? Like, kneeling on the water, kind of wild. And Jesus says, oh, you have little faith, right? So it returns once again. Like, this whole episode is about faith. And then Simon keeps weeping, and he's saying, don't let me go. Don't let me go. Don't let me go. Which, honestly, almost made me cry. I've never cried in the show so far. But I'm about to cry right now. I'm not going to do it, though. I'm not going to do this. But it's just, don't let me go. Like, here he was... Like, he voiced earlier that he thought he might be a mistake. And once again, like, it takes all of these different steps to where he thinks he's a mistake, and he admits that to John, but then he thinks the issue is that it was with Jesus, right? And he's saying, no, it's you. You were the problem. You didn't care about me. You didn't care about me. But then he recognizes, no, it was me. Like, he really was, like, he felt he was the mistake, and he thought that Jesus should let him go because he just isn't living up to it. And now he's saying, don't let me go. He's not saying that he deserves to be there. He's just saying, don't let me go. And, like, because whenever he's saying, don't let me go, I don't think he's just talking about being afraid of the water. I think it's more than that. It's like, I need you. Which I just thought was cool, because him and Shmuel are kind of going through the same thing, right? They were taking all of their frustrations and putting them on Jesus, and they both had to come to the realization that they were actually the problem. Which I just thought was cool. That was really, really neat. And Jesus just calms the storm. He's just like, hey, peace, be still. And it calms. And I'm wondering if that means that they're going to, like, because technically there's two moments where Jesus calms a storm in scripture. One is this moment, but it's not really explicitly mentioned. Like, in the gospel, like, it just says, like, they got in the boat and then, like, immediately they were at the water. I mean, they were at the shore. But then there's also the other moment where Jesus is asleep in the boat and he calms it. It makes me wonder if they just blended those together or if they're going to do it again. I don't know. We'll see. And then a cool thing is, so they calm the storm, and then Jesus is, like, holding Simon in the boat, and everybody else is kind of like, oh, what's going on? And then Simon is literally still, like, even, I love that. Even in the boat, like, he doesn't just, like, sit there and, like, get over it. Even in the boat, he is, like, hugging Jesus like a little baby. And he's in front of all these other grown men, yet he is still weeping. And he's saying, don't let me go. Don't let me go. And he just, like, won't stop saying it. And then we cut to Eden in the mikveh, also praying to God, don't let me go. Beautiful. Just like, mwah.
I thought she said, don't let him go.
I think she said, don't let me go.
Oh.
I think. Yeah. I could be wrong.
I thought she was praying for Simon.
Oh, maybe.
I thought that she was saying...
I thought she said, don't let me go.
I don't know.
It worked either way. I haven't clicked out of my, like, watch through in there, so I can like go back like 15 seconds or something like that. We'll see. I don't know. We'll see. Don't let me go. Okay, cool. And then Psalm 77 starts playing in the background, and we get our final little vignette that'll close up this episode. We have Simon walking, right, and he's returning back home. We cut to Matthew weeping with the tassels, which I'm assuming is a flashback. I don't know. Like, I don't know if he'd be weeping with the tassels right now. I'm assuming that should have happened maybe, like... I don't know when it could have happened. Because it was daytime outside, and he's weeping with them. So it would make most sense if he was doing that, like, after his conversation with Mary, but before he returned in episode 7 to apologize. The only issue with that is that they were, like... She was at his house, and he stormed out of the house, and then he came back later
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know when that happened. Maybe it was when he got back. It just seems kind of weird that he would be weeping about the tassels now.
I was thinking, like, all of them, like, it was current moment for all of the ones that they were showing.
That's what I figured.
Just because, I mean, I guess it's supposed to be, tying back to, since, like, him holding the tassels was, like, a big scene for him, I guess, just thinking about what he just saw and, like, the things that Jesus said and, like, being on the boat and all of that, and then thinking about the implications and how that could apply to maybe, I guess.
That makes sense. Yeah, it did
seem like they're in current time.
Yes. Yeah, because they all seem like current time except for the David part. But, but yeah, like, that just kind of confused me because I'm not sure why Matthew would be crying now. But, what you said, maybe.
He's just emotional about what
it's possible. He was super excited about the feeding of the 5,000, but that Simon thing just shook him up. He's like, I gotta go home and cry. And then we have Gaius with his 6th son. This thing frustrated me. Because this is literally like, this was in the trailer for the show. And we're like, oh, okay, so I guess Gaius is going to be the one. And, like, obviously this is probably going to happen next season.
Yeah.
But, like, it was so weird to me that, like, you see him with the 6th son. And that, like, it's so weird that they showed that in the trailer. Like, it seems like they probably shouldn't have shown that because that was kind of a big spoiler. Yeah. But really misleading in a way to where you're like, oh, like, the only way it's not a spoiler really is if they actually do include the miracle, right? Because if they include the miracle, then that was just a foretaste to be like, ooh, guess what? You were right. Whereas now it's like, oh, well, no, that actually did just kind of spoil the whole season because, like, we wouldn't have known that Gaius was that. It would have been a big twist. Whereas, like, because I saw that in the trailer, I was like, oh, okay, I guess Gaius is that guy. And so I knew where his story was heading prior. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, so technically I knew where Gaius' arc was heading prior to the season beginning.
Right.
Which is kind of frustrating to me. I was like, oh, dang. I mean, I don't really care about spoilers that much because obviously we know Jesus is eventually going to die and everything. But just from a creative choice, I'm like, oh, why did you include that in the trailer? Because that's like actually like a pretty key moment. Like we wouldn't have known that otherwise. And then we see Rhema writing. I don't know what Rhema's writing, but she seemed kind of happy and content.
Maybe a letter.
Yeah, she might have been writing back to Mary or something like that because Mary had written to her. Or maybe she was practicing scripture or something. I don't know. And then we see Thomas looking through the window out at the moon or something, and I guess he was thinking about Rhema. I have no idea.
They wrecked back, so it made sense.
Yeah, and another thing that we see here, and this is the thing that chronologically is kind of strange to me. We see John the Baptist in prison, which is just a weird choice. I guess they just didn't have time to include it. I guess they're gonna do it next season. It's very weird to me that John the Baptist is still alive. Because in the Bible, at least, like, that is one of those, like, firm things where, like, we know that John the Baptist died before the feeding of the 5,000. Because that's, like, one of the reasons, like, really the context of the feeding of the 5,000 in Scripture is vastly different than it occurs here. Like, in the feeding of the 5,000, the whole point is Jesus trying to get away, and then crowds follow, right? And the main reasons he's trying to get away are because the disciples got back on their 2x2 mission, and so he's trying to kind of get away with them to kind of like just recover and just recuperate. And then also John the Baptist was killed, and he needs to grieve. And so they go away, but then crowds follow, and he says, we'll take care of them, right? And so it's really it's a moment where he's teaching them about ministry and how you have to put others first, and it's a really cool thing. But for this one, they don't have John the Baptist dead here, which is just kind of weird to me, because John the Baptist in Scripture dies on, like, it's almost kind of essential that he dies very early on in Christ's ministry. Whereas right now in the show, we are more than halfway to the cross, and John the Baptist is not dead yet. Which is just kind of a weird creative choice to me. Like, I don't know why, like, because John the Baptist is, I mean, don't get me wrong, he's one of my favorite characters, like, in Scripture. I love John the Baptist, but like, one of the big things that sets things going forward is that John the Baptist died early on, because later on, like, you literally have, like, Herod Antipas being like, oh, I think John the Baptist is back from the dead, and like, people are confused about who Jesus is. And so it's just kind of weird to me that John is still alive at the end of the season, because that was like one of those guaranteed things. Like, whenever they said feeding the 5,000, I was like, oh, okay, so John the Baptist has to die in this season. But at the end of this, he's still just in prison, which is just kind of weird. What do you have any thoughts about that at all?
I mean, that is kind of weird that we are, if you think about it chronologically, being halfway to the cross and he is still alive.
Yeah, it's just
that is interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's not a big deal, really. It's just one of those things that it just seems very weird to me to have, like...
Yeah. Well, I also think it's interesting just because he hasn't really been in a lot of scenes or anything. Like, he hasn't been, like, a crucial plot line part of the show, except for, what was it, episode 1 or episode 2, whenever Andrew gets to go and visit him. But other than that, his name has been mentioned a few times, but he hasn't been in it. Yeah. So it is kind of weird that he's still alive, in the sense that it's not like he's being utilized a lot in scenes or throughout the plot for anything. Yeah, so he's just kind of there.
Part of me thinks that it's because they've established the relationship between John and some of the apostles already, that they recognize that his death will have a very big emotional toll on them. Yeah. And I think that they probably realize that they just don't have enough time in this season to address it. Yeah. And so I imagine they're just saving it for the next season. Yeah. But it is just kind of weird to me, like, especially because they're not really constrained on time. But I think it's like there would have just been too many plot points, and they, you know, as a creator, you have to kind of like make those choices. It was just kind of weird to me. I'm like, well, he really kind of, he needs to be dead. And the main reason I say that also is because, like, John the Baptist in many ways was kind of almost more popular than Jesus, like during his lifetime. Like, it seemed like that, because like you still hear John the Baptist being talked about like by other people outside of Scripture, and even in the New Testament, people are like, oh yeah, we follow John the Baptist. Like, there's just a lot, like, John the Baptist was a big deal, and it seems like in many ways John died early on, and then Jesus rose to popularity largely in light of John's absence. And so there's like this big trade-off. And like a lot of times Jesus turning to people saying, oh, well, you know, you had John the Baptist killed. And like some of his teachings reference that. And so it's just kind of weird to me that he's still there. It's not, once again, not a big deal. And I think I know why the creators of the show did it. I was just not expecting to see that. And so I just thought I'd address it. Okay. Simon finally arrives at his house, and him and Eden reconcile, and very beautiful shot there. Like the cinematography was like very great. And then we cut back to the flashback, where we have Asaph reciting the stuff to David. And then David finally, with tears in his eyes, says, I think it's ready. And it cuts to black, and, you know, you hear the thing, and then we have, like, credits roll for days and days and days, and we have bloopers at the end and everything. All right. What'd you think about the episode? Final thoughts. We'll wrap this video up.
I thought it was really good. I think it was a good way to end the season. I think it wrapped it up really well. And I think that there was a nice arc to, like, Simon and Eden, both individually, and I think, like, their marriage too. I think there was a lot of different points, and I think there was a good beginning, a middle, an end. I think that they wrapped it up and developed it really well.
Yeah. The Simon and Eden story was, I think, handled very well, for sure. Yeah.
And I think it's cool that they're handling, I don't know, just showing, like, marriage not always in a positive light. Like, it's cool that they're showing, like, the hard sides of it, because I think it's easy, like, well, especially if you're just looking at, like, Hollywood stuff, it's just, like, lovey-dovey stuff, you know what I mean? Like, the fact that they're handling really hard conflict, that's not something where there's a easy yes or no or a right and wrong person, that they're putting these characters in situations that are in the gray area. They're not in the black and the white. And you have to think through it, and there's a lot of moving parts. I think that's really cool, and showing how to handle it in a Christian context. In a biblical foundation, I think is cool.
Yeah, that's probably the one thing that's most impressive about the show, is just how they write relationships and just like the dynamics there, because it's really helpful, because you can tell that these writers are just very careful with it, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the plot points are inspired by stuff that the actual writers went through, and they're like, hey, let's just be vulnerable here and put that into the storyline.
And it's not even just Simon and Eden's marriage, it's relationships in general, and even individuals too. Just individual people. For sure.
What are your thoughts on the inclusion of, like, King David and stuff in this episode?
You know, I don't really know. I was thinking about that whenever we were watching it, and I thought for the episode it made sense because it bookended, and the episode was revolved around a psalm, and it was a psalm that they were singing. But the fact that he was included, I thought it was not odd, but, like, just kind of different. I don't know.
Yeah, part of me was wondering, the reason I asked is because I was wondering, like, if it felt kind of weird to me. Yeah. To where, I mean, I like it. David's, like, other than Jesus, David is hands down my favorite character in Scripture. I love David. Not just because we share names. But that's not a bad thing, too. To me, it makes me wonder if, like, the creators feel like they have dug themselves into a hole where they feel like they have to include Old Testament flashbacks. Because they've done that in the previous 2 seasons, and people like them so much. Because, I mean, I really like this. I like the Old Testament flashbacks, but whenever I was watching it, it was one that didn't really feel necessary. It does bookend things very well, but I was just trying to think, and this really is like, this is me analyzing it from like a creative standpoint. Mm-hmm. Like whenever you're creating this stuff, you're always trying to figure out like what is necessary, and you're trying to get from point A to B as quickly as possible, mm-hmm. right? So every line matters, and like even from a production standpoint, mm-hmm. you're trying to figure out what's necessary and what can be cut. And I was thinking like, what do we really gain from seeing David here, right? Like whenever David showed up in the last season, it gave some very important context to a teaching Jesus had. Yeah. Right? Whereas right here, we literally just have David showing up and he's sitting there with his wife. And I guess it's to draw the parallel between David and his wife and Simon and Eden. But we don't know of any strife between David and his wife. And you know what I mean? Like she's also pregnant, kind of like Eden was. So there is a parallel. I just don't know what it really contributed to, you know what I mean? Like you just have David, you basically just have a man and a woman, and one is pregnant and one lost a baby, and they're both hearing the same psalm, and they're both being moved by it. And then David finishes by saying, I think it's ready. And I don't know, it was just one of those things, it didn't feel super necessary. And no. I did like the scene. Like, I'm not saying I didn't like the scene. I love that, and I love the Old Testament flashbacks. It just makes me wonder, creatively speaking, if they feel like they put themselves in a place where like, ooh, we need to have at least one of these per season, because it's like, it's in the finale episode. And so it was just an interesting creative choice, because it didn't feel like I don't think it necessarily added anything to Yusuf delivering that psalm later, right? Mm-hmm. Because later on, whenever Yusuf shares it, it doesn't like he doesn't really say much about David or Asaph. Right. He just says this is a psalm about being angry and frustrated. And he gives the context you need right there, and then he says it. Mm. And the scene itself doesn't really impact that much. Yeah. And we kind of have that at the beginning of the season too, right? Whenever Simon, he also quotes a psalm to the disciples whenever they're all in that circle. Mm. And like that one didn't have a flashback scene. You know what I mean? Like whenever I was just watching it, these are just things I wonder. I'm like, oh, like, I guess that's just how I watch shows. I just analyze stuff, and I'm like, okay, so every single aspect of this is meticulous, and it's put there for a reason. And I'm just trying to figure out what that reason for that scene was. Yeah. Because all the other ones were very important. Like back in season 1, you had the digging of Jacob's well, right? And that's because Jacob's well came in later. And you also had the flashback to Jesus getting lost in the temple, because that came in later. And you also had the flashback to people celebrating the Sabbath day, and that came in later, right? Like, so all the flashbacks served the purpose of giving the context. Like the Sabbath one was teaching you, oh, this has been a thing that's been going on for thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And all of them have served a purpose, whereas this one was like, well, if you took those two scenes, like the beginning and the end thing, if you took that out of the episode, what would we be missing? Yeah, like you wouldn't really be missing anything. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. I do like that. I just wonder, like, I mean, I'm totally fine with them adding in random flashbacks, because I like seeing the Old Testament. I'm more of an Old Testament person than a New Testament person. I love the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to hear your opinion on that. Yeah. And I was just thinking about it. So, yeah. Cool. All right. Do you have any other thoughts you want to share about this episode?
I don't think so.
Cool. Yeah. Well, guys, like I said, this is not going to be the only video that I have on this channel about this episode. I'm going to do so many other things. I'll do my episode breakdown. I'll do my Is It Biblical? Who knows? Maybe I'll do something else. I have no idea what all I've got planned. We'll do episode rankings. We'll do all that stuff. We've got a lot of different things that we're going to be doing in between seasons 3 and 4, so just be sure you're subscribed. But until then, it's been a long day. We have watched 2 episodes back to back, and we have filmed a total of 4 hours of videos, basically. So I think we're going to sign out. Yeah. And I still have to film my, whenever she heads home, I'm going to be filming my spoiler-free video. And hopefully that one is not nearly this long. I'm hoping it's like 20 minutes or less, but we'll see. Yeah. We'll see. Yeah. So there we go. My name is David.
And my name's Brienne.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Mm-hmm. Y'all have an absolutely blessed day, evening, morning, night, whatever it is whenever you're watching this. Just have a blessed, awesome life. I hope you have a great life. Please do. But also return so that I don't see you only in heaven. Can you tell that I'm getting tired? Ooh, we're going to have ice cream after this, aren't we?
We can.
All right, you know what? I'm getting in a better mood now. All right, see y'all later. Be sure to just comment down below if there's anything we missed, if you have anything corrections. Like, if you want to talk about why you think that David scene was so necessary, let me know. I like hearing about all y'all's stuff, and I like interacting with y'all, and I do read all your comments, even if I don't get to reply to all of them. So, thank you so much. Have a great time. See y'all later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.